Hello there, dear listener. We hope you're enjoying this lovely discussion. If you're not already aware, this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. A Pan-African Nationalist and Garveyite network come to showcasing the rich and varied thoughts of African people. We have an exciting lineup of shows that we think you'll enjoy, including
the Victor Maxine Podcast.
I think black people require too much buy-in. Like, we constantly have to sell black people on things that are beneficial to black people.
The Pro-Black Perspective Podcast.
I'm fearful that our people are not really studying how to get ahead, and we're kind of, continually staying behind.
The Harsh Reality Podcast.
It don't matter. I think people so dumbed down, it wouldn't matter what you reveal to them. They still are in the matrix. They're in the simulation. They're going to keep doing what they did their livings. So it don't matter.
The Learning Curve Podcast.
Sexual access has never given you economic empowerment. The only person who has ever been economically empowered by a sexual relationship is the wasp and his woman.
The Cathedral Cheek Show.
When we start rising up to fight for our own, I guarantee you they'll stop doing what they're doing. I guarantee you they would have let their brother go. They was waiting to see what black folks was going to do.
Brother Bakari Podcast.
Black people love to claim folks that hate them, right? They're a slave master, and they are ashamed of who they really are.
The Forecast Radio.
Like, if you pray to the same deity as, like, your enemy, and that God blesses your enemy more than you may want to reconsider who you praying to,
And Tanzan, African Mind.
Africans generally are welcoming of everyone. Sometimes, to my consternation, I think that they should be less, welcoming.
If you love our podcast network, we would be grateful if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on social media, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and check out our website at www.kwazradio.com for more information. Thank you for tuning in. And now, back to the program.
Oh, damn. Okay. I was talking. All right. So, long story. So basically, I'm doing a new computer setup. I don't know if you guys can tell the resolution is different. I got a mobile computer. Basically, it's called the Steam Deck. It's pretty cool. Cheap computer basically means that I can podcast anywhere in the world. And so, and it's a gaming computer. So obviously you could also play games if you wanted to. Machen says we can't hear you. Can you still not hear me? Or can you hear me now? I think you guys can hear me right now, maybe. Wait, hold on a second. I don't know I can't tell if the messages are late or hold on a second. Yeah, okay, yeah. All right, so I could be heard now. So what I was saying was, I got this computer last week. Messed everything up. For some reason, I plugged out my computer so I could, because the mic started acting funny. I have an external mic, so I plugged out the computer and then I forgot I was in the Ethernet, and so everything just got disconnected. And yeah, that was it. So this week we're going to go over some of the stuff from last week. But last week was really good. So I think it's actually even better if I just start fresh, because this chapter, there's going to be a lot to learn based off of economics, and particularly my current understanding of economics. And it's not this is not a bad read. Now, again, I don't really like the hard socialist leanings per se, but it's not the like there's facts with the fiction, and so I want to let you guys like I want to be able to clarify to you guys where the fact and where the fiction is. But all right, let's go. Let's get into it. Oh yeah, you can kind of see the resolution is different. I'm using this Steam Deck, and it's like a handheld computer, so I think it's like an 800 by 600. As opposed to my monitor, which is like 3,900 by 2,400 or something like that. But all right, so it's Chapter 3, Africa's Contribution to European Capitalist Development, the Pre-Colonial Period. So British trade is a magnificent superstructure of American commerce and naval power on an African foundation, right? And trade is, like, again, remember, I want you guys to remember, trade is the way to wealth. I want to write a new book. I told you guys. I think it's going to be about, let's say it's 21 troops. 21 is a number I chose because of 42, principles of my, obviously. So 21, it's half of it, whatever, right? And, I couldn't get 42 subjects. So I was like, all right, whatever, let's get a significant number. Economics being one of the subjects, I think I pointed out this. There's 3 ways to make money, okay? There are 3 ways to make money. One is by gift. Somebody gives you the money, obviously. 2 is by, and, gift you could probably even include, like, just finding it or something. I don't know. But gift, the other one is stealing it, okay? Like, if you steal money, you make money, obviously. And the third one is trade. Okay, so basically the only people who are going to be rich on this planet are the lucky, you get what I'm saying, the thieves, and the traders. Okay, like people who trade. And what trading is, I want people to understand this. I'm going to put it in the book, and it also was from Wealth of Nations. But trading is basically buying money. How do you buy money? And that's one of the big hiccups that we don't realize. Like, basically, like, for instance, some brother, and this is a brother on Discord, he's a good brother, wise intellect, right? Good brother. And he put on Twitter or something like that, or like I saw something related to this on Twitter where this guy in South Africa was building these e-scooters. And then at some point, the guy in South Africa was like, I can't do these e-scooters anymore because nobody's buying the e-scooters. And it's like, if nobody's going to buy what you're selling, you have to either change products or you're going to be poor. You see what I'm saying? Or you're just not going to make money. You're not going to be able to buy money unless people with money are willing to buy whatever it is you're selling. And what happens with the e-scooter is that, yeah, okay, e-scooters are nice in Europe, but you're in the middle of South Africa. So nobody's going to spend, how much, so on and so forth, for a scooter. Or very few people are going to do that. And that's like one of the principles that we don't get as an African people, because we kind of think, hey, we should just be given money. And nothing works like that. And I could tell you guys, I'm going through some sort of, like, basically I have somebody who, like, owes me some money, but they have no skills for getting money. You get what I'm saying? They have no skills for getting money, and so they kind of just next week, and it's just like, yeah, like that's but that's pretty much our continent, unfortunately. On a large scale, our continent is like that, and this is why we have to do things about it. So anyway, this is Malachi Pasta White, The African Trade, the Great Pillar in Support of the British Plantation Trade in North America, 1745. I think this is the book that he wrote it. So this is another one. If you were to lose each year more than 200 million livres than you now get from your colonies, if you had not the exclusive trade with your colonies to feed your manufacturers, to maintain your navy, to keep your agriculture going, to repay for your imports, to provide for your luxury needs, to advantageously balance your trade with Europe and Asia, then I say it clearly, the kingdom would be irretrievably lost. So again, remember, there's 3 ways to make money. Either somebody gives it to you, which is not very likely unless you are somebody's child, right? either somebody trades with you, no, either you steal it, which is what the Europeans obviously did, or what the Europeans did on top of stealing was they traded. You know, they went into beneficial trades, and that beneficial trade is really what makes what really made, let's say, Western Europe more successful than Southern Europe. Okay, because what England did was that it started to do the manufacturing, okay, and selling the manufactured goods for a wider profit, as opposed to, say, Portugal and Spain, who, while they stole wealth and they stole people and they stole more people and more wealth, right? They didn't produce anything. So, you know, stealing can only get you so far. So Bishop Maury, arguments against France's ending the slave trade and giving freedom to its slave colonies. So this guy, apparently a bishop, mind you, was arguing against ending the slave trade and arguing against giving freedom to people. We got Mr. IC3 Black in the building, Mr. Tekken himself. How you doing, brother? Peace, peace. Mr. Quaporera himself. All right, so let's go. 3.1, how Europe became the dominant section of a worldwide trade system. Beware of the superficiality. Oh, actually that's Tyler. Tyler, you remember that, you ever played Tekken? And there was this Eddie, I think it's Eddie Long, I think. The brother who was doing the Quaporera in that martial arts game. So Mr. IC3 Black says he used to work in, maybe, I think Konami or something, or Temco or whatever. Tecmo. But basically, you know, for Tekken. And he said that, you know, he was one of the minds behind putting a Quaporera guy in that game. Isn't that cool? All right, so let's go to it. So because of the superficiality of many of the approaches to underdevelopment and because of a resulting misconception, it is necessary to re-emphasize that development and underdevelopment are not only comparative terms, but they are also have a dialectical relationship one to the other. That is to say, the two help produce each other by interaction. Let me actually just check my audio, see if it's let me just see.
African people.
Oh wait behind. I can't tell if you guys can hear my fan, but all right. Two help produce each other by interaction. Western Europe and Africa had a relationship which ensured the transfer of wealth from Africa to Europe. The transfer was possible only after trade became truly international, right? And that takes one back to the 15th century when Africa and Europe were drawn into common relations for the first time, along with Asia and the Americas. The developed and undeveloped parts of the present capitalist section of the world have been in continuous contact 4.5 centuries. The contention here is that over that period, Africa helped to develop Western Europe in the same proportion as Western Europe helped to underdevelop Africa. And and this is another thing. So one of the things I'm going to write about is race. You know, I think we don't understand race well enough, and I'm actually a little hesitant to write this out, but one of the big things about race, a bit of medicine said I'm not outside. Why do you say that? I think we don't understand. This sounds good. Well enough. All right, so Mr. Icy Black says Namco Game Company. Yeah, so that's historic. Because I remember, you know, being a youngin and going to a local pizza store and seeing the Tekken game, and I was looking around at the characters, and you know, a black character stood out, and I was like, we play that, you know? So that's pretty cool. That's a moment that, you know, like I said, we owe a lot of what we know to our elders. You know what I mean? So respect to the chief. Now, when we talk about race, I want people to realize, right, that race is, like race has been, like, we've been deceived about race. I don't want to say it like that. Oh, you can't hear my fan. Ah, shit. Okay, all right, let me, hold on a second. For some reason, I can't hear it on the phone. It's just blowing up, you know? Well, you know I can turn it down. All right, let me turn it down. It's just hot AF, you know? It's just hot AF, so, but it's okay. I could tolerate it for a minute. All right, so yeah, so the thing we don't understand about race is this. it seems like, because originally we thought, hey, or originally the thought is this, African people, the clines in, I think it's clines in clusters, right? Clines in clusters basically means, biological entities, right? Depending on the clinal group, okay, like the climate, the temperament, the temperature, this and stuff, they're like certain mutations or certain adaptations will be beneficial and propagate itself, right? So basically, let's say Africans are, especially West Africans, are known for like flat noses and or wide nostrils and things like that. And the idea is, hey, yeah, you would have that in a moist area, as opposed to, like, let's say if you're in an arid region where you might have narrow features because that's just a beneficial thing about that feature, about that location. And that adds up. Okay, that adds up, because you could also see how the wildlife, like other wildlife, if you will, also, has these sort of features, right? Like has different, arid features, long features, tall features, whatever, right? But this doesn't account for the reality that there were other hominids on the planet. Okay? There were other hominids on the planet, and those other hominids somehow, at some point, did procreate with humans. Okay? And some of their offspring survived, and because some of their offspring survived, and these offspring, coincidentally, I don't want to say coincidentally, but these offspring, coincidentally correlate with different racial groups of today. As to say that these are not purely, the racial groups of today are not purely evolutionary, clinal, natural selection type things. The races of today are in fact admixtures with other hominids. That said, they are not even, like, technically they're not even your same species. We just call them. We just say that, well, honestly, the human race, that's what I'm saying, human race. Honestly, people say we're all the same race. Like, there's only one race, the human race. That's not the case. Okay? Normally, the reasoning behind that is this: the conventional wisdom is that things within the same things that are not in the same race cannot procreate. Okay, that's the conventional wisdom. It's not true. Or they say things that are not in the same race, if they procreate, they cannot, like they only procreate infertile things. So like you have the mule. So you say the horse and the donkey are not the same race. No, sorry, I think it's the horse and the donkey are not the same race, because if they do procreate, they'll have a mule which is infertile. However, is every mule going to be infertile is the big question. Like the experiment is not widely done enough such that it's known that every mule is going to be infertile. You just see, 2, 3, 4, even 1,000 examples. But maybe there's an example where it is so on and so forth. Point being, the European actually descends from a Neanderthal. And I think the Asian descends from, I don't remember the other one, but like something, I think it starts with a D maybe, the Denisovan maybe. But because a European descends from this Neanderthal, right, it technically, like, you as a species, you as an African, looking for another species to not do you in, and if you understand who the Neanderthals are historically, you'd be completely confused. You'd be completely flummoxed, especially considering that the Homo sapiens killed off the Neanderthals, right? But long story short, what I'm saying is that if you understand this genetic sort of point of view, a lot of what we say as African people stops making sense. It's like, because the Neanderthal is kind of basically like on par with the gorilla or the chimpanzee. You see what I'm saying? And I say that, or I mean, obviously they might be closer to, you know, hominids than those, you know, gorillas or chimpanzees, but at the same time, they're just not humans. So thinking, oh yeah, well these, you know, like these, I call them hybrids in the Book of Power, but these hybrids, if you will, right? If these hybrids are in fact, I mean, it's just complicated. Like, why would you expect gorillas and chimps to do for you, like do well by you? You know what I'm saying? Because the thing is, gorillas and chimps don't expect humans to do well by them. You understand? Or if a gorilla or a chimp thought that a human had its best interest, you would obviously say, "What's wrong with this gorilla?" Now, I'm not saying Europeans are more animalistic. I think all life that's not plant is animal, right? Well, or insect or something. But and that's what it is, right? But like, you have to be mindful that what you're asking of Western Europe doesn't make sense when you factor in the Neanderthal genes. But a lot of us do not factor that in. Like, when you factor in the different ancestry, and that ancestry from some sort of weird fluke of nature, right? And bear in mind that allegedly the Neanderthal used to be a predator of humans. So just a reminder. Now, granted, I wish I spoke more about the Denisophan, you know, as opposed to just Neanderthal, but I'm not really familiar with them. But that it is what it is. But all right, so anyway, that was it. The first significant thing about the internationalization of trade in the 15th century was that Europeans took the initiative and went to other parts of the world. No Chinese boats reached Europe, and if any African canoes reached the Americas, as sometimes maintained, they did not establish two-way links. What was called international trade was nothing but the extension overseas of European interests. The strategy behind international trade and production that supported it was firmly in the Europeans' hands, and specifically in the hands of the sea-going nations from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. They owned and directed the great majority of the world's sea-going vessels, and they controlled the financing of the trade between the four continents. Africans, a little clueless to these tricontinental links between Africa, Europe, and the Americas, Europe had a monopoly of knowledge about an international exchange system seen as a whole, for Western Europe was the only sector capable of viewing the system as a whole. So this is another important thing, especially when people talk about, oh, Africa, and you know, they had a role in slavery. It's like the whole thing was designed for Europeans' interests. And the reason what I was talking about last week and why I wanted to redo this podcast was this is where GDP comes in. GDP is this measure of international trade in Europe's interest. If you do international trade that doesn't factor into GDP per se, okay, that doesn't factor into, or if you, like, basically, if I go to, like for instance, I got this restaurant. By the way, congratulations to me. I got a restaurant in Africa, right? But I got this restaurant. I'm feeding people in Africa, right? So what does that mean? That means that if we're selling, all right, let's say this. We're selling biryani, right? If we're selling biryani, which is like, you know, not as good as jollof, but you guys get it. It's like a rice dish, right? I think it's actually an Indian rice dish, right? But whatever. You're selling biryani, right? You collect the rice and then you quote unquote manufacture. You're not manufacture, but you raise its value by, you add value, do value added things such as cooking it, right? You put it to heat and you spice it up and you do this, so on and so forth, right? And then you sell it to somebody who wants to eat it, right? That does not go into GDP. Okay? If, however, you were to package the rice and sell it to a European country, right, then it would. If you were to cook the rice and package it, or you just package it till it's ready to cook, in the microwave or whatever, then it would. Now, again, if you package the rice and make it ready to cook for the microwave, and then you put it in the microwave at the restaurant or whatever, right? That's not going to add to your GDP. You see what I'm saying? Realistically, and I mean, obviously, I'm giving a little bit of a hyperbole, a little bit of an exaggeration, but my point is that a lot of times we look at we look at Africa through the eyes of what good is it to Europe, and then we say, oh, the GDP is low, right? Or basically, it's not good to Europe. It's not good to Europe, and then we condemn Africa for it. Oh, we got to raise our GDP. The GDP is a good measure, blah, 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 blah. When it's not. Because, like I said, you could have a pretty good life. So, like, for instance, right now, this restaurant, I asked the manager, right, to upload the income versus the expenses onto a Google Sheets, right? And I did a bunch of Google Sheets computations, like equals sum, this minus that, or like, let's say income minus expenses, and that would give you, or income plus negative expenses equals profit, right? Or I give you the running average for the profit, or I give you the accumulated profit, right? So on and so forth, right? What's interesting about this restaurant is that it's consistently profitable. Okay? Consistently profitable. But again, now that's a good thing to set up for African people. Something that is consistently profitable. Okay? That doesn't factor into the GDP per capita. And so what would factor into GDP per capita is if we made microchips. For instance, if we made electronic scooters, but only if we sold them. And Europe, and we're gonna talk about this, I think at some point we're gonna bring up the World Trade and the IMF. Europe is not interested in you selling them manufactured goods. Okay? And I say this because remember, one of the during World War II, what was considered the most scientific and intellectual people was Germany. And what people don't realize, what a lot of us don't realize, is that their leader at the time was also intellectual and scientific. A lot of us think of him as just a mass murderer, sure. But if you read what he writes, he says, look, it's in the benefit of Germany to make sure that Africa does not industrialize, but rather Africa gives its resources to us. Okay? And I don't know if he just isolated Africa or if he was like the rest of the world, but basically you do not want other people to industrialize. And this is an intellectual, right? And I bring this up to say this. The World Bank and the IMF are also run by intellectuals who came to the same conclusion. Okay? They came to the same conclusion. The United Nations, ran by intellectuals, they came to the same conclusion. It is in the world interest for Africa to be under-industrialized. And what happens is this. If you don't know who these people are, and again, like I said, different races, if you don't understand that these are another group of people who are looking out for their best interest first, who are looking out for a first world order, a new world order, first world order, right? If you understand that these people are looking out for themselves and their own interests, you understand that you should actually fight them. Well, not just fight them, but you should not be listening to them. You should not take their advice. If the gorillas were telling you what to do, you would tell them no. Okay? But if Neanderthals, and the thing is this, if Neanderthals were telling you what to do, you would tell them no. Okay? But when the Neanderthals have children, have descendants, and those descendants tell you, hey, we're actually humans too. It's just one human race. It's just humanity. And you believe it, that's where you get fucked up. You're supposed to say, let me take a genetics test. Okay, you actually have remnant DNA of a different species. And that species was a predator against us. I know it's a little bit extreme, I know, but actually, I think everything I just said was a little extreme. And I brought up everybody's least favorite dictator, but I'm trying to tell you guys the truth. I know it sounds like that other guy, it's like, I'm just trying to tell you the truth, but for real, if they themselves, if you look into this canon and somebody's like, hey, look, we have DNA of this other species that you murdered off. Okay? Anyway. All right, fam. Nobody got no comments on that? All right. Europeans used the superiority of their ship and cannon to gain control of all the world's waterways, starting with the Western Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast of North Africa. From 1415, when the Portuguese captured Ceuta near Gibraltar, they maintained the offensive against the Maghreb. Within the next 60 years, they seized ports such as Argila, El Ksar Es Sagir, and Tangier, and fortified them. By the second half of the 15th century, the Portuguese controlled the Atlantic coast of Morocco and used its economic and strategic advantages to prepare for further navigation, which eventually carried their ships round the Cape of Good Hope in 1495. After reaching the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese sought with some success to replace Arabs as the merchants who tied East Africa to India and the rest of Asia. The 17th and 18th century, the Portuguese carried most of the East African ivory, which was marketed in India. While Indian cloth and beads were sold in East and West Africa by the Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French, the same applied to cowrie shells from the East Indians. Therefore, by control of the seas, Europe took the first steps towards transforming several parts of Africa and Asia into economic satellites. Now, again, remember, they seize the ports. I can't stress enough. Trading is the means to wealth. Okay? Trading is the means to wealth. Simply, like, buying money is the ways to wealth. It's not so easy, but like I said regarding the farm, regarding the restaurant, it's consistently profitable if things are safe and secure. Okay? If you don't take too many bad sales, like if you don't do anything too risky, you could be consistently profitable. The manager said that there's somebody else who wanted to just sell potato chips, just chips, and it's not potato chips, fries, right? They call them chips in Tanzania, but who just wanted to sell fries and mishkaki, which is like chicken on a stick. I know, beef on a stick, and like beef skewer, and you just sell that, and knowing that people are willing to buy it for whatever kind of money. You turn a profit as long as you don't, buy too many potatoes or buy too much meat. You know what I'm saying? And you can get the potato for cheap, chop it up, make the chips, sell the chips, and you make profit. Now, obviously, you can't, not everybody can do this because, the more sellers, the less buyers. But you understand what I'm saying. So anyway, when the Portuguese and the Spanish were still in command of a major sector of world trade in the first half of the 17th century, they engaged in buying cotton cloth in India to exchange for slaves in Africa to mine gold in Central and South America. Part of the gold in the Americas would then be used to purchase spices and silks from the Far East. The concept of metropole and dependency automatically came into existence when parts of Africa were caught up in the web of international commerce. On the one hand, they were the European countries who decided on the role to be played by the African economy. On the other hand, Africa formed an extension to the European capitalist market. As far as foreign trade was concerned, Africa was dependent on what Europeans were prepared to buy and sell. And I think this is where I came in last week in regards to what's really meaningful to say here. When the Europeans control the market, you lose. Like, whoever controls the market wins. Okay? If I could, basically, it's because essentially the prices, for instance, when it came to this restaurant, I was telling the manager, hey, you should sell this for this. No, what does the menu look like? And they were like, you should, you sell fries for this much, you sell fries for this much, you sell mishkaki for this much, you sell this for that much, this for that much. there's kind of an unspoken price that everybody goes. Now, I was telling the manager, I said, look, sell it for higher. You get what I'm saying? Sell it for higher. They're like, no, people are not going to buy for higher. And so I was like, look, you're going to be broke if you don't sell for a bigger profit. But the reality is that, obviously the profit is still not, great at this point. But again, it's consistently profitable, but it's not highly profitable. But at the same time, it's like that's just part of the whoever controls the market prices. Now, if there was a scarcity, right? If you were the only person selling mishkaki, right? Somehow, right? Then yeah, you could sell it for higher. And so what happened with the Europeans was this, right? Let's say we go back to the now, granted, cotton cloth is not the best thing, not a necessity to need. But let's say you're in Africa and you all right. So one of the things Europeans did have that Africans didn't was firearms. Okay, so it became, yeah, okay, we can give you firearms, but you know what I'm saying? But it's going to cost you this, and somebody might say, well, that's too many, and they're like, okay, well then you're not going to get our firearms, and we'll just give it to the next guy. They say, okay, no, we don't want you to give it to the next guy, even though you're still going to do it. But in that case, here are some people. Whoever controls the market is the winner, and that's what happens inside of the foreign. And this is the big argument for Pan-Africanism. That's what I was meant to say. This is the big argument for Pan-Africanism, because when it comes to the market rates, right? Pan-Europeanism is in effect. Okay? So the Europeans are like, hey, look, we have this firearm. The price, the fixed price that's going to be profitable to us is going to be, let's say 3 people. Okay? 3 of your rival people. Right? And they decide, look, we're not going to undercut each other. But if you're not united with your brothers and sisters, you are going to try to undercut them. I was, like I said, I also invested in this sister's bar, right? And she was trying to undercut the other sister, another sister's bar right beside her. So what happens is that both of their prices are going to go lower and lower as they try to undercut each other, and the winner is going to be whoever's buying from them, right? Because they're undercutting each other, and they're making their profits, or they're lessening their profits, whereas. Yeah, so that's really, and I'm actually remembering a comic, no, not a comic, a skit that I saw, where these 2 ladies are sitting next to each other. I think they're white ladies, but these 2 ladies are sitting next to each other, and one of them is selling, they're sitting next to each other, so they're both selling a dozen eggs. Okay, they both have 2 dozen eggs, and they're both selling a dozen eggs, right? So, both ladies have a price of 100. Let's say 100 shillings or something like that. Let's just pretend. Or $100. No, not $100. How much is eggs? I don't know. Now these days it's probably $10. But let's say it's $5 each, right? They're both selling the eggs for $5 each. Okay? So one of them notices that one is selling for $5, so they put their price down to $4.50, right? And so they sell at $4.50, right? The other person notices, oh, this person's selling for $4.50 right next to me, and it's $5, so I'll sell it for $4. The other one goes down $3.50, okay? So one of them has the idea, okay, well, you're selling for $3.50. All right, well, then I'll buy both of your remaining eggs, right, for $3.50. And they're like, good, haha, sucker. And then the person starts selling their eggs for $20 each. You see what I'm saying? Like, if you have no competition, or if you and your competition have some, like, if you're competing with your brothers and sisters, what happens is that you're going to lower your prices and lower your profits. Whereas the Europeans got together and said, look, we're not going to compete with each other. But Africans didn't. And so whoever is not competing with their own brothers and sisters, right, is going to win in the market. It's the same as if I said, hey, look, I'll sell these eggs to the highest bidder, right? Then I win, because the buyers if they have no limit, for instance, then they'll say, oh no, I'll buy the eggs for $5. No, I'll buy it for $6. No, I'll buy it for $7. No, I'll buy it for $8. That's all just profit for me. So what happened with regard to Europe and Africa, and what's still happening with regard to Europe and Africa, is the Europeans are united in pricing, and the Africans are not. And so the Africans are always going to lose in a trade with Europe until they decide to get together with what we call Pan-Africanism. Or not even just Pan-Africanism, but until they get together to negotiate their interests in trade, if they're doing trade. And I hope that was a good breakdown. I can't tell because y'all quiet. Y'all quiet. As soon as my fan went off, y'all... Can I even be heard? Let me check. Let me double check. As soon as my fan went off, y'all went quiet. All right. So anyway, so Europe exported to Africa goods which were already being produced and used in Europe itself. Dutch linen, Spanish iron, English pewter, Portuguese wines, French brandy, Venetian glass beads, German muskets, etc. Europeans were also able to unload on the African continent goods which had become unsaleable in Europe. Thus, items like old sheets, cast-off irons, technologically outdated firearms, and lots of odds and ends found guaranteed markets in Africa. Africans slowly became aware of the possibility of demanding and obtaining better imported goods, and pressure was exerted on the captains of European ships, but the overall range of trade goods which left the European ports of Hamburg, Copenhagen, and Liverpool was determined almost exclusively by the pattern of production and consumption within Europe. Okay, from the beginning, Europe assumed the power to make decisions within the international trading system. That's all. They still to this day, all right, to this day, all right. An excellent illustration of that is the fact that the so-called international law, which governed the conduct of nations on the high seas, was nothing else but European law. Again, GDP, just European, like value, and right here in accordance with Europeans' needs. That's what I want to read. So Africans did not participate in its making, and in many instances, African people were simply the victims, for the law recognized them only as transportable merchandise. If the African slave was thrown overboard at sea, the only legal problem that arose was whether or not the slave ship could claim compensation from the insurers. Above all, European decision-making power was exercised in selecting what Africa should export in accordance with Europeans' needs. Okay? I want to highlight that. As a matter of fact, I'll use the yellow highlighter. I want to highlight this. Oh, how does it work? For some reason I hear shit, it's black. How do you do this? Shit. So I'm on the computer, so it's a little bit harder to... I can't even find the Control Z. I don't have a keyboard. So let's go to undo. Alright, so I won't even highlight it. But my point was European decision-making power was exercised. So this is IMF World Bank. IMF World Bank says, hey, you know what would be good for you, Africa? Export what we need to produce goods to sell to you. This is the IMF and World Bank. We'll give you money, okay? We'll give you money. Mr. Icy Black says, yes, great point. I saw that video. What video? But yeah, Europe has decision-making power. The IMF and World Bank have decision-making power where they go to African leaders and they say, look, we could help you trade with us more. Okay? We can help you trade with us more. We'll give you money to build up some industry, so build up some infrastructure for you to trade more with us. Okay? And all they're saying is this: we will buy decision-making power to control what you export and you exporting what we need. What we need you to export are your minerals that you're not using so that we can use them and then sell you the iPods and the iPad and the iPads and the iPhones, so on and so forth. That's it. And we fall for it to this day. Okay? We fall for it to this day. All right. So the ships of the Portuguese gave the search for gold the highest priority, partly on the basis of well-known information that West African gold reached Europe across the Sahara, and partly on the basis of guesswork. the Portuguese were successful in obtaining gold in parts of West Africa and in eastern Central Africa, and it was the Gold Coast which attracted the greatest attention from Europeans in the 16th and 17th century. Gold Coast is Ghana, by the way. The number of forts built there was proof to that effect, and the nation involved included the Scandinavians and the Prussians, Germans, apart from other colonial stalwarts like the British, Dutch, and the Portuguese. Europeans were anxious to acquire gold in Africa because there was a pressing need for gold coins within the growing capitalist money economy. Since gold was limited to very small areas of Africa, as far as Europeans were then aware, the principal export was human beings. Only in a very few places at a given time was the export of another commodity of equal or greater importance. For instance, in Senegal there was gum, in Sierra Leone, camwood, and in Mozambique, ivory. However, even after taking those things into account, one can say that Europe allocated to Africa the role of supplier of human captives to be used as slaves in various parts of the world. And so I want to remind people, too, that the European does this slavery thing, but he took over the market from the Arab. Okay? Another thing they don't teach you right, because they don't want to go teach you this, was that the Arab, you know, the Moors, if you will, were in southern Europe, and they were capturing and enslaving and selling and trading even Europeans as slaves, Europeans and Africans as slaves. Okay, what happens is after the Europeans push out the Arabs, they take over their city, they take over their knowledge. They take over their abilities. They take over their capabilities, and they go around the world and take over their trades. And if you were paying attention earlier, and I think you were, but if you were paying attention earlier, you see he even says it earlier here. He says, from 1415, when the Portuguese captured Ceuta near Gibraltar, they maintained the offensive against the Maghrebs, against the Moors. Within the next 60 years, I'm not sure the Maghrebs were the Moors, but I'll just say that for now. Within the next 60 years, they seized ports such as Arzila, El Qasar, Es Sigir, and Tangier and fortified them. They seized the ports. Then, by the second half of the 15th century, they were in Morocco, controlled the coast of Morocco, okay, and eventually used the ships to get to South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, in 1495. All right? And look, some success to replace Arabs as the merchants. You get what I'm saying? So a lot of us will say, hey, you know, these Europeans enslaved us. Yes, but understand that there was already that widespread slavery, and it was in the form of the Islamic Muslims. And I just said Islamic just because I know maybe I got some Muslim people listening don't want to say nothing. Machen says Europeans are more Pan-African than African people. They give us all bad deals no matter where they find us in the world. Exactly. They know to look at us as their enemy. Okay? And they have, like, they're not looking at us from a tribalistic view. Oh, well, this is that. This is so forth. Because they understand, look, we're just trying to take over what the Arabs were doing. Okay? We're just trying to take over what the Arabs... And the Arabs looked at you as one group of people, too. Infidels. Or what have you. We'll keep going. When Europeans reached the Americas, they recognized its enormous potential in gold and silver and tropical produce. But that potential could not be made a reality without adequate labor supplies. The indigenous Indian population could not withstand new European diseases such as smallpox, nor could they bear the organized toil of slave plantation and slave mines, having barely emerged from the hunting stage. This is why in islands like Cuba and Hispaniola, the local Indian population was virtually wiped out by the white invaders. At the same time, Europe itself had a very small population and could not afford to release the labor required to tap the wealth of the Americas. Therefore, they turned to the nearest continent, Africa, which, incidentally, had a population accustomed to settled agriculture and disciplined labor in many spheres. Those were the objective conditions lying behind the start of the European slave trade, and those are the reasons why the capitalist class in Europe used their control of international trade to ensure that Africa specialized in exporting captives. And so, I don't really like when we brag about, oh, we make the best slaves, but it is what it is. And another thing to remember too about these Native Americans, and I think there's this. Oh, it's hard to watch this show. It's probably the most realistic, kind of realistic version of American plantation slavery, and it's really brutal and gruesome, and it's not really for the faint of heart. But you watch Goodbye Uncle Tom or something like that. Not Uncle Tom. No, it could be Goodbye Uncle Tom. I don't remember. Let me look it up. But there's this. I think it might have something to do with Nat Turner, honestly. But I think it's Goodbye Uncle Tom or something like that. Let me look it up real quick. I'm not gonna do it on the screen. Goodbye Uncle Tom. No, okay, so it's not Goodbye Uncle Tom. Oh yeah, it's Goodbye Uncle Tom. Okay, so Goodbye Uncle Tom was these Europeans made up a movie where they kind of do like go over slavery. I mean, they kind of like a mockumentary of slavery, and it's horrible because you see a lot of the bad things that happen with us, but including a lot of our, like you got the bedwenches, who like the willing bedwenches and shit like that, as well as the breeding farm, which was just awful. But why do I say this? I say this to say, they had a scene where they showed the Native Americans, and the Native Americans are just like in prison and desolate and sad. And one of the things that we don't really factor in when we're bragging about we're the better labor, like Bitter Medicine said, I hate that brag, is this was their land. So once upon a time, I used to I was on early internet. You would search things or you'd get random news stories, and one of the random news stories was like the 10 saddest songs ever. And obviously they're all European songs and all that kind of stuff. But one of them was this Elton John song called shit, I don't remember the name of the song. Oh, Indian Sunset. Indian Sunset. And so that's considered one of the saddest songs, as well as this other song about there's like some David Bowie, spaceman, this guy dies in space type thing. Now at the time I didn't really find these songs sad or really like them. Obviously I think Eminem sampled Indian Sunset for a Tupac song, Ghetto Gospel, right? But basically, if you listen to the song, like it is pretty damn, like it's sad because it's white boys singing it, but it's the last struggle of these Indians. Like basically, you take their land to the point where they can't find a home, and the only thing they're left for them, after having a nice established life, is to die. And so the question of, well, why didn't they just keep working on plantations? It's like, because it's their land. Unlike for us, where, beyond the people who claim that it's our land, which is, a little wild, but unlike for us, we were stolen. We had nowhere to go. Okay, we had nowhere to go. Our home was a million, like 1,000 miles away, 2,000 miles away. These people were on their land. You get what I'm saying? So their whole thing was they had to fight to get their land back. Even if you were to fight, because that's the thing about America, you fight to get you fight, and then it's like, but like, is this even your land? You know what I mean? Like if you were stolen from another place, what do? You know what I'm saying? Like you would run, like you would want to leave, but like go where? And I think actually somebody said that Jamaica, the name Jamaica, is actually a Twi term for something like we can't return home or something like that. But anyway, look at the comments. The comments look like they turned up. So Mr. IC3 Black says, excellent point to Matron. Bit of Medicine obviously said he hates that brag. Matron says they studied us for decades before they tried to take over the trade. They documented everything about us to codify our existence and keep enslavement going. Europeans play the long game. We should do the same. Yup. Mr. IC3 Black says the solution is to establish a central bank of Black African origin. CBOBAO. Right? Yeah, we definitely need to have our own capital direction, and a lot of us don't think so. I was not on the live chat. I was only on the top messages, so I think I missed some things. So Mr. IC3 Black earlier said Black people are trying to fight against. Wait, so he said you are correct. Black Africans do not understand race well enough. Black African people are trying to fight against racism as a business. White supremacy is a religion, a faith with a God. God is white. Whiteness is a value. The reason for skin bleaching. The only way to defeat white supremacy is to defeat the white God. Only an entity with the power of God can defeat God. A Black African deity must be created to save Black Africa from white supremacy. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, again, I'm not a religious guy, but yeah, I get that point, because that's the thing that, you know, sticks to me. You know, I think we all, you know, sometimes see things, you know, and I think Nat Turner shared his vision of, oh yeah, you know, maybe a Black deity is where it's at, and I think I might have seen something like that once upon a time too. Mr. IC3 Black says, "Goodbye, Uncle Tom," which was the name of the movie. It's not for the faint of heart, but you guys, if you should look at it, you should watch it. Those were the objective conditions lying behind it, so on and so forth. All right. So obviously, if Europe could tell Africans what to export, that was an expression of European power. However, it would be a mistake to believe that it was an overwhelming military power. Europeans find it impossible to conquer Africans during the early centuries of trade, except in isolated spots on the coast. European power resided in their system of production, but at a somewhat higher level than Africans at the time. European society was leaving feudalism and was moving towards capitalism. African society was then entering a phase comparable to feudalism. The fact that Europe was the first part of the world to move from feudalism towards capitalism gave Europeans a head start over humanity elsewhere in the scientific understanding of the universe, the making of tools, and the efficient organization of labor. Europeans' technical superiority did not apply to all aspects of production, but the advantage which they possessed in a few key areas proved decisive. For example, African canoes on the River Nile and the Senegal coast were of a high standard, but the relevant sphere of operation was the ocean, where European ships could take command. Exactly. So Africans weren't necessarily using, like, we're trading by sea, but mostly by rivers. And again, this is really important to understand. Again, this sort of trade between countries by the river system, right, or on the coast, along the coast, does not apply to global trade. The global trade is when you start trading across the ocean. Because I want to put it this way, in fact. Okay, let's say Koku is, no, let's just say it this way. Delivery adds value. Okay, delivery adds value, or convenience adds value. So, all right, let's say for instance, me and Koku were hanging out, right? And Koku is like, "Hey, Oni, could you get me, could you go to the store and get me a bottle of, get me a drink, right?" The reality is this: the drink costs, let's say the drink costs, $3 or whatever, right? I could say, okay, sure, give me $3, and then come back and give him the drink, right? And basically, that makes sense. That makes a little bit of sense, but it doesn't really make sense. Or in the sense of this, I could also be like, hey, yeah, that drink costs $3, sure. Just give me $4 and I'll get it for you, right? Like, charge him a delivery fee, for my labor. Okay? And usually he'll say, yeah, sure. Because essentially, otherwise I'll be working for free. Now, granted, you can be like, well, y'all buddies, so there's nothing wrong with working for free. But what I'm saying is that you could always add value just based off of the fact that you're delivering something. And that's what oceans do. That's what rivers do. That's what, like, you could just add value based off of the fact that, yes, it is, I did get it for this much, but the fact that I brought it to you, or the fact that I stored it for you, or the fact that I made it convenient for you, I can charge you more. Right? And so what happened with the Europeans is that because essentially it's cheaper than if they were to go. You get what I'm saying? So what happened with Europeans is this, that they're bringing something from across the ocean. Something that you can't even get in your continent. You can't get running down the store, bringing it across the ocean so that you could buy it across the street. So they add a lot of value. Okay? You know, or like for instance, the example of the German brandy or something like that, or the French wine, right? You're in Senegal. How are you going to get French wine? Now you might be like, well, I don't even want French wine. Okay, that's fine. What if you're a Frenchman in Senegal? Right? Then you do want French wine, right? And so if somebody brings you French wine, they have to charge you more than if you had gotten in France. Right? Immediate profit. Profit for just traveling, for just transporting. And that's something that we don't factor in. But it's one of those things that has to be factored in. And like I said, I appreciate Nyerere, because Nyerere actually goes over this in his book. So what's the name of the book? Ujamaa, I think, right? So anyway, but that's it. So for example, African canoes on the River Nile and the Senegal coast were of high standard, but the relevant sphere of operation was the ocean, where European ships could take command. West Africans had developed metal casting to a fine artistic perfection in many parts of Nigeria, but when it came to the meeting with European beautiful bronze, the Europe beautiful bronzes was far less relevant than the crudest cannon. African wooden utensils were sometimes works of great beauty, but European produced pots and pans that had many practical advantages. Literacy, organizational experience, and the capacity to produce on an ever-expanding scale also counted in the European favor. So what he's saying is, but like mainly, I think the main thing to take away is the cannons and the ships. You know, the cannons and the ships. So he says European manufacturers in the early years of trade with Africa were often of poor quality, but they were of a new variety and were found attractive. Esteban Montejo, an African who ran away from a Cuban slave plantation in the 19th century, recalled that his people were enticed into slavery by the color red. He said it was the scarlet which did for the Africans. Both the kings and the rest surrendered without a struggle. When the king, I'm trying to understand this. When the king saw that the whites were taking out those scarlet handkerchiefs as if they were waving, they told the blacks, "Go on then, go and get a scarlet handkerchief." And the blacks were so excited, 6Y, the scarlet, they ran down to the ships like sheep, and then they were captured. And there they were captured. I don't fully understand that. But I think he's saying, I think what he's saying, I'll just try to, I mean, maybe he'll explain it. But anyways, it's that version by one of the victims of slavery is very poetic. What it means is that some African rulers found European goods sufficiently desirable to hand over captives which they had taken in warfare. Soon, war began to be fought between one community and another for the sole purpose of getting prisoners for sale to Europeans, and even inside a given community, a ruler might be tempted to exploit his own subjects and capture them for sale. A chain reaction was started by European demand for slaves and only slaves, and by their offer of consumer goods, this process being connected with divisions within African society. So, this is where things become really complicated. Okay, this is where things become really complicated. I'm reminded of this movie I saw, this Asian movie I saw, while I was on the flight. So when you're flying, you start watching more movies, right? And so the movie was about, I think, a Chinese spy and a Korean spy or something like that, you know? But like an undercover Korean spy. It's an interesting comedy, spy comedy, right? But but the thing about writing, the thing about movies and writing is that they try to be realistic and have realism. And I think one of the things that happens is that I think the story goes that they sent a Korean rookie to some sort of, you know, stop some gun trade in like Korea or something. because they were kind of sending her to die, right? And or like I think she was like a Chinese rookie, rookie, and they just sent her in to die from the Koreans or whatever, right? But she ended up, whatever, no spoilers, right? But one of the things was that when the Korean found that there was a Chinese spy among them, right? And they were like, hey, you got to protect this Chinese spy. They were like, we don't have to protect anybody outside of our nation. Like, we're about national security. Now, everybody was Asian, but realistically, and this is something that I want to stress in this book, realistically, the nation is the highest form of organization. And so it's unfortunate, but it's like, let's say I become, like I established myself in Tanzania, right? I mean, I do multinationalism, so it's a little different, but realistically, if you're just doing nationalism, which is what most people are going to do, right? Or what most people are, like what makes the most sense, honestly, right? You're not supposed to look out for the other nations. Like, you're not, like, if you're in Tanzania, you're not supposed to look out for Rwanda. You're not supposed to look out for Uganda. You're not supposed to look out for Gabon. Now, granted, if you have alliances, if you have a Pan-African organization, that's different. If you don't, then you're not supposed to. And that's where a lot of us, like we don't like it, but that's what it is. In the sense of, when you look at World War I, you look at World War II, the Europeans, they were not looking out for each other. Okay? They established alliances and they fought along those established lines. They were not looking out for each other. Okay? Sometimes you pick a side of your human group and then you fight. Like, even if you talk about the American Civil War, what they said was that one of the bloodiest battles in America, at least, was well, obviously it's one of the bloodiest battles in America, but was in the Civil War, where these whites said, hey, look, you're not a part of my nation. The Confederacy is not the Union. Now, granted, the Union and the Confederacy still held on to, certain beliefs that, so on and so forth. And that's not to say that people in Africa didn't hold on to certain beliefs and so on and so forth. But the truth is that, this is why I say, when we talk about nationalism or we talk about Pan-Africanism, we have to be in Africa and really have to choose a nation, because what happens is that sometimes these nations will fight, and you have to, I mean, obviously you could be peaceful with your neighbors and so forth, but you have to know when the fight is the fight. Say what you will, Uganda and Tanzania, I believe, had a border, and Nyerere and Idi Amin had to go to war with each other. And I mean, we love the lovey-dovey, or sometimes people say, hey, you know what Kagame is doing in Congo? And it's like, well, Kagame is supposed to look out for Rwanda. He's the president of Rwanda. And if Congo is, and I mean, obviously, I would love for the Congo to get its act together, and I would hate for an African to hamper the Congo. But at the same time, you have to look out for your team. So you have to pick a team. And what happens with us is that we, like particularly us in the West, we don't pick a team. We say, hey, all black people. But when you do the all black people, it only goes so far. And like realistically, you don't. It's just a refusal to choose a team. So we're gonna look at some of the definitions Mr. IC3 Black put out. He says, power. The source of power is the moral high ground. One must secure the moral high ground to unify organized people. The source of white power is their idea of righteousness as given by the Pope. Yeah. I mean, the Pope from Catholicism. But yeah, white people definitely, I would say that probably applied more, earlier. But like today, the source of white power, I don't know, I'll have to think about that. So, Mr. IC3 Black also says justice and power. One can only secure order and maintain organization by securing the moral high ground, right? And he says, White Power BIS, Bank for International Settlements. We are establishing a central bank of black African origin to challenge the Bank for International Settlements. Yeah. I mean, I do think us securing capital, that's what Mr. IC3 Black is saying. Us securing capital is fundamental. And us not being driven by Europeans is fundamental. But for some reason, we're not doing that. By the way, let's continue. It is often said for the colonial period that vertical political divisions in Africa made conquest easy. This is even more true of the way that Africa succumbed. Oh, by the way, I caught up to where I left off last week. So this is all fresh to me now. It is often said for the colonial period that vertical political divisions in Africa made conquest easy. This is even more true of the way that Africa succumbed to the slave trade. National unification was a product of mature feudalism and of capitalism. Inside of Europe, there were far fewer political divisions than in Africa, where communalism meant political fragmentation with the family as a nucleus, and there were only a few states that had real territory solidity. Furthermore, when one European nation challenged another to obtain captives from an African ruler, Europe benefited from whichever of the two nations won the conflict. Any European trader could arrive on the coast of West Africa and exploit the political difference which he found there. For example, on the small territory that the Portuguese later claimed as Guinea-Bissau, there were more than a dozen ethnic groups. It was so easy to set one off against another that Europeans called it a slave trader's paradise. Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. You have that kind of division. But again, you expect people to look out for their ethnic group, but that's why what we have to do is, like when we talk about Pan-Africanism, we have to really put in the work in order to, we really have to put in the work in order to de-ethnicize and de-tribalize. Basically, the Europeans had their tribalism and their ethnicity, and then they formed their nationalism. And then after their nationalism, there's actually nothing higher than that. But what happens is this. They have their alliances. Okay? They do their alliances. But they don't do things for people who are not their allies. With the exception of right now America and Ukraine. Okay? So as far as I can tell, Ukraine and America, Ukraine is not a part of NATO, but America's still trying to do shit in regards to Russia and Europe, Russia and Ukraine. But that's what it is. It's like you form these alliances, right? And you form these trade agreements, and you form these national policies or these international policies and international laws. And the Europeans did that earlier, and for good reason. They were colonized in from 711, I think, to 1492. Okay, and if you guys remember 1492, when Columbus sails the whatever, right? That's the same year that they finally got their political operation together. Okay, why I'm saying this is to say that, the Europeans, for instance, we call them Anglo-Saxons. That's not a group. It's the Angles and the Saxons and the Normandy and the so on and so forth. All of those things were tribes or ethnic groups, right? All of those were tribes, and then they got united under the King of England. Okay? They got united after a lot of infighting and the need to no longer be divided against a common threat, i.e. Arab enslavement or what have you, right? They got together, and then they used that sort of that newfound nationality, if you will, right? They used that newfound nationality to form alliances and then operate on a grand political unit and basically detribalize from within, right? But when they come to Guinea-Bissau, for instance, right, the people didn't have a need to detribalize. And by the time they did, it was too late. You understand? The European already came and said, hey, look, these are a bunch of people who are just different tribes. We could tell them, hey, look, this guy's trying to kill you. Hey, I was on the other side of the planet. They said I could just take your shit. Oh, they sent me to collect your stuff. Slave trade is paradise. But again, you know, you have to understand, like I wanted to say, I think I said in the Discord. Make sure you guys check out the Discord. What I said in the Discord was, black people. I mean, the only real science is probability, right? And so, how you were going to detribalize before the Europeans arrived is very improbable, you know. But all right, although class divisions were not pronounced in African society, they too contributed to the case with which Europe imposed itself commercially on large parts of the African continent. The rulers had a certain status and authority, and when bamboozled by European goods, they began to use that position to raid outside their societies, as well as to exploit internally by victimizing some of their own subjects. In the simplest of societies, there were no kings. It proved impossible. Now, in the simplest of societies where there were no kings, it proved impossible for Europeans to strike up the alliance which was necessary to carry on a trade in captives on the coast. In those societies with ruling groups, the association with Europeans was easily established, and afterwards Europe hardened the existing internal class divisions and created new ones. So, in effect, particular aspects of African society became weaknesses when Europeans arrived as representatives of a different phase of development. Yet the subjugation of the African economy through slave trade was a slow process at the outset, and in some instances, African opposition or disinterest had to be overcome. In the Congo, the slave trade did not get underway without grave doubts and opposition from the king of the state of Congo at the beginning of the 16th century. He asked for masons, priests, clerks, physicians, etc., but instead he was overwhelmed by slave ships sent from Portugal, and a vicious trade was opened up by playing off one part of the Congo kingdom against another. The king of the Congo had conceived the possibilities of mutually beneficial interchange between his people and the European state, but the latter forced him to specialize in the export of human cargo. It is also interesting to note that while the Oba, king of Benin, was willing to sell a few female captives, it took a great deal of persuasion and pressure from Europeans to get him to sell male African prisoners of war who would otherwise have been brought into their ranks of Benin society. So again, selling females is not necessarily better, but I wanted to go over the Congo situation where, yeah, you have to know, like, again, if you don't realize that you're talking to another species, everything sounds weird. You want masons, priests, clerks, and physicians, but you have to, and we were talking about this yesterday on Shoot the Breeze. Make sure you guys check out Shoot the Breeze. But we were talking about this yesterday on Shoot the Breeze where, you gotta realize that people have agendas. The European himself just came out of slavery and seeing how profitable slavery is. I mean, I'll put it this way, right? You don't really know what El-Andalus looks like, okay? I'm not saying that I do. But the Moors built almost every castle in Europe, okay? So all that opulency that you see in feudalistic Europe, right? And I'm just saying that I don't know the exact percentage, but I think it might be that the Moors did actually build all the pyramids, right? Not all the pyramids, all the castles. But mainly the point being that they get all of this opulence from getting this by making these by doing slavery in like throughout the world, and so. Now the Portuguese say, "Hey, look, we finally kicked their butts. We learned how to do their ships. We learned a bunch of their technology. We did this, so on and so forth. We get all this shit. What do we do now?" Right? And they said, "Why don't we try to get wealthy like they did? Why don't we look for some gold? Why don't we look to sell people? Why don't we do?" That's it. And so, yeah, you have to now when these Europeans come to you and you're an African, they come to you, you got to know their history and you got to know their agenda. And their history and agenda was, oh, we're going to buy some people. We're going to do like the Arabs. You might not know who the Arabs are, but trust me, they were the world power before us. We want to be the world power. We just kicked their butts somehow. And for those of you who don't know how, one of the stories I heard was that the mercenaries, like essentially the Moors eventually had a mercenary army, and the mercenaries turned against them. So y'all know how recently America was getting excited that the Wagner group was turned against Russia. That was what happened to the Moors. Anyway, so and the reason why they were excited is because they knew that was what happened to the Moors. Mr. IC3 Black says, did the Chinese detribalize with communism? Well, the Chinese, I believe, are majority. I can't remember the name of the group, but they're like majority one group, like 91%. Like even the language we call Chinese is actually that language, like that ethnic group's language. I don't remember how come for some reason I can't remember what it's called, but like they don't speak Chinese, they speak Mandarin. There you go. So the Mandarin ethnic group is actually like 95%. So somehow the Mandarins like just dominated over, and so like again they detribalized. I feel like much before the communism, but they detribalized, and that's the advantage that they have. So Mr. ICT Black says, I suspect that the Chinese use communism to unify China against the West. Now that China are more unified, they're allowing the Chinese more travel tourism. Oh yeah, but that's what you mean. Like yeah, they had their cultural revolution where they got rid of their Westerners, they Westernized people, and yeah, communism, socialism is like for what it's worth, right? And this is why a lot of African people like socialism. Socialism is pushing back against the international, like the international monetary system, if you will, or the international arrangement. It is, like obviously it's its own international system, so you got to be wary of that. But it's one of the systems that's like, hey, you know what? There are these, there's this Western capitalist model that is trying to exploit the rest of the world for a handful of manufacturers. Okay, and some people are like, we don't want to be a part of that global system, and so a lot of those people would be the socialists. So one of the things, for instance, like if you look at Lenin and Stalin and them, right? Russia was a backward country at one point, with very little industrial development, and all that kind of stuff, and so and like a hyper exploitation of their labor, you know, as just, you know, collecting resources, blah, 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 blah. And so the socialist revolution in Russia was designed to essentially industrialize itself and like unite itself against the Western coalition. So that's one thing that people like. That's why, you know, Walter Rodney would you know, buy into the hype, because, you know, at the end of the day, that's what you want for your people anyway. You know, you want them to get out of this international system of Western capitalists, in a sense. You know, it's not that you dislike quote unquote capitalism as much as you don't like the Western capitalists running the show. And I think that's one of the things that we don't tend to differentiate. But that's what it is. So Mr. IC3 Black says, Mandarin, Cantonese, and many more. Yeah, but like I think the Mandarin are like 95% or something like that. But they're like a huge majority of ethnics when it comes to the ethnicity in China, and their language is the national language. Once trade in slaves has been started in any given part of Africa, it soon became clear that it was beyond the capacity of any single African state to change the situation. And this is why people say don't blame Africa. In Angola, the Portuguese employed an unusual number of their own troops and tried to seize political power from Africans. The Angolan state of Matamba on the river Kwango was founded around 1630 as a direct reaction against the Portuguese. With Queen Nzinga as its head, Matamba tried to coordinate resistance against the Portuguese in Angola. However, Portugal gained the upper hand in 1648, and this left Matamba isolated. Matamba could not forever stand aside. So long as it opposed trade with the Portuguese, it was an object of hostility from neighboring African states, which had compromised with Europeans and slave trading. So in 1656, Queen Nzinga resumed business with the Portuguese, a major concession to the decision-making role of Europeans within the Angolan economy. So I actually don't remember people talking about her resuming business with the Portuguese, but what I would say is that, yeah, you see, like this is the reality of, like, this is like, it's kind of like, I don't want to deal drugs in my community, right? And that's fine, but, or like, let's say if I'm anti-gun, like, yeah, if I can do that. Go to the hood and be like, hey guys, you can't buy drugs. You can't sell drugs. You can't do that kind of stuff. And see what happens. See what happens. You know, especially if you're not the state. Now, like I said, you go to Tanzania, it's much harder for you to get drugs and guns and all that shit because the state is not for it. You know, the state is kind of on the prude side, no disrespect. But when it comes to Africa, when it comes to America, if the state doesn't care if you're selling drugs to yourself. If that's how you choose to live. So yeah, you try that, and the state's gonna sit by and watch the people gut you like a fish. Mr. ICT Black says, unite Black Africa. What ideology is best for Black African unity? Socialism, communism, capitalism, etc. Consider Cheek says Jumbo. So I think ideology is Jumbo Considera. I think ideology is just a word at this point. I think it's just a word at this point, and I think that Black people, we tend to participate in this conversation without actually being in the driver's seat. You know, we are a lot of people that we should be, like, realistically, we should be sitting down with Museveni and saying what practical things he could do as a state leader. You get what I'm saying? But like if I'm sitting down with if I'm sitting down with I don't know, whoever, right? And I'm just sitting down with somebody and just chatting to them. Oh yeah, well, I think ideology, right? Not even what Uganda can do right now, but ideology. That's where things fall apart, because that conversation is not going to, it's not going to do anything for, whatever country I might be interested in. And that's the thing too. It's like you have to actually choose a country. That's the thing that a lot of us, particularly us in the West, do not do. We do not choose a country, And when you don't choose a country, what happens is that it doesn't even matter what you think, because what's good for Uganda might not be good in Rwanda. What's good in Rwanda might not be good in DRC. Like me opening this business where I sell these foods, that's good in Tanzania, right? I mean, a restaurant is generally good, but like, would a restaurant really be good in Port-au-Prince, Haiti? No. Would a restaurant really be good or profitable in Port-au-Prince, Haiti? No. Okay, not at the rate of violence there. Just like the DRC, not at the rate of violence. If I go to northern Nigeria and I'd say, let me just open up this restaurant, it's like a stupid investment. Okay? Every country is different, and so you have to choose a country and then really go on the ground and do the work. But a lot of us don't want to do that. We want to talk about a general, no disrespect to my brother, but we want to talk about a general economic system, and it's like, yeah, that economic system is, like, it's all well and good if you can do it, but if you're not doing it, it's like, it just, like I say, everything that works, all that works or something like that. I don't know, but you guys get what I'm saying. I said nothing works in theory. All that works and works. Okay, so nothing works in theory. Like there's no oh man, I'm just gonna like nothing. But what works is works. Putting in the work is what works. And that's why Considera showed up. Considera says housing is always good anywhere you go. Yeah, I mean, look, shit. You know what? I'm not even gonna. Please, I wish. Shit. Because sometimes people are delinquent, and the laws are just against you. The laws are against you as a landlord in some places. Some places it's for you as a landlord. Some places it's not. So like for instance, in New York City, it's not the best for you. Like basically, there's some places with high amounts of tenant rights, versus yeah. So it's just really complicated. But anyway, so another example. But I mean, yeah, but like, and then like I said about the violence in like the violence in certain regions could be a trouble. So we got Brother Bakari's in the chat. Peace and Black Power to Oni in the chat. Yeah, Brother Bakari, he's policing the police, so he's taking a break from helping our family out. So appreciate you for coming through. Oni says he's apologized. He's Bakari says he apologizes. I'm late as all get out. Nah, man, you were doing your work, man. You were doing the work. It's all good. Mr. IC3 Black says, no, it's no good for the black African diaspora to choose a country state. The diaspora must think like the Bank for International Settlements, United Nations, International Criminal Courts. Yeah. I mean, yeah, but like you want to, if you want to do work, you gotta just like it's kind of like if I were to say, I mean, because Mr. IC3 Black is in England, so as far as I remember, so it's different. But like, let me say, like for instance, for somebody in America, right? What's good in what's good in New York, or what needs to be done in New York might not necessarily be what needs to be done in Florida. Or like a classic example is this. So in New York, what you probably want is leaner gun laws, right? Or increased gun ownership. Okay? But that's not a problem in Florida. Or that's not a problem in Texas. You get what I'm saying? Or like for instance, you might want more black people to go to the shooting range in New York. But that's not a problem in Texas. You get what I'm saying? Or on the other side, you know, you might want let's say in I don't want to say Atlanta, let's say another like a smaller county in Georgia, you might want black people to do more coding and more technology stuff. That might not be the same thing in New York City where black people know coding and stuff. Or if you're talking about self-hate, you know, there's so many issues that are really local. But if you look at it from a from a global perspective, like if you just say, you know, black people don't want to get guns, right? That don't make any sense. If you're like, it depends on where you're local to. You get what I'm saying? So Mr. ICT Black says international organizations are stronger than individual. Yeah, definitely. International organizations, you definitely want that though. Great point, Matron says. We need to think like multinational think tanks, banks that develop black communities globally. Yeah, we definitely want, like, we kind of want both, but what we don't do right now is we don't think locally. Or we don't work locally. And that's where things fall apart, because you want to be international as well as local. But like if you're just international, what happens is that like things don't go as well. Does that make sense? Mr. IGT Black says black Americans will never wield power until they are part of an international black organization that can make sanctions. Yeah, you definitely want an international black thing. Consider says, but leasing properties with the option to buy wins every time. Yeah, Consider knows the stuff. Consider knows the stuff. Leasing properties with the option to buy. Y'all need to write that down, right? Or make sure you subscribe to Considra and listen to what she says and what she does. So, all right, let's keep reading. So another example of African resistance during the course of the slave trade comes from the Baga people, if y'all don't know about the Baga, in what is now the Republic of Guinea. The Baga lived in small states. In about 1720, one of their leaders, Tamba by name, aimed at securing an alliance to stop the slave traffic. He was defeated by local European resident traders, mulattoes, and other slave trading Africans. It is not difficult to understand why Europeans should have taken immediate steps to see that Tamba and his Baga followers did not opt out of the role allocated to them by Europe. A parallel which presents itself in this manner is the manner in which the Europeans got together to wage the Opium War against China in the 19th century to ensure the West African capitalists would make profit while the Chinese were turned into dope addicts. So we're talking about China here. Of course, it is only as a last resort that capitalist metropoles need to use armed force to ensure the pursuit of favorable policies in the dependent areas. Normally, economic weapons are sufficient. In the 1720s, Dahomey opposed European slave traders and was deprived of European imports, some of which had become necessary by that time. Agaja Trudeau, Dahomey's greatest king, appreciated that European demand for slaves and the pursuit of slaving in and around Dahomey was in conflict with Dahomey's development. Between 1724 and 1726, he looted and burnt European forts and slave camps, and he reduced the trade from the slave coast to a mere trickle by blocking the paths leading to sources of supply in the interior. European slave dealers were very bitter, and they tried to sponsor some African collaborators against Agaja Trudeau. They failed to unseat him or to crush the Dahomean state, but in turn, Agaja failed to persuade them to develop new lines of economic activity, such as local plantation agriculture. And being anxious to acquire firearms and cowries through the Europeans, he had to agree to the resumption of slave trading in 1730. So, I don't know, this story kind of mirrors the one from that movie. I don't know if you guys saw that movie. I forgot the name of the movie already, but there was a movie about the Dahomey recently, and the Dahomey king, or the woman king. But the weird thing about that movie is that they gave most of the credit to the women around him. Like, for instance, he didn't want to attack the slave for it, but she, like, one of the women did. So it's kind of weird that the story was like that. I mean, maybe that is how the story goes. I have no idea. But like, this is like a more, like, this is the story as far as Walter Rodney wanted to recall it, or wanted to communicate it. But that's another thing too. It's like, you have to be able to produce your own things, right? And if you don't want to be in a dependent relationship with somebody, but if you are in a dependent relationship with somebody, you should make sure that they're more dependent on you. But also, I think this was one of the lessons too, that when I was in when I had my own organization, right, this brother would come in and he would tell us, you know, one thing that we tend to overlook, for instance, is that African cooperation with Europeans is kind of like the bread and butter of European success. Okay? And his example was really, you know, in America, basically, if the police are driving through your area and they put on those flashing lights, we get out of the way. Now, granted, we get out of the way because, you know, if you stay in their way, it's illegal or whatever. But if they want to run through your fence, if they want to chase down a suspect, if they want to do anything, we kind of sit by and let them. You understand? Whereas there are some black areas where they do not let the police do anything. And the police do not function in those areas. Now, granted, sometimes those areas do become a little bit more lawless, right? Because, you know, like, come on, you do one illegal thing, you're not going to stop, right? But that's the thing. It's like a lot of it sometimes is European cooperation. When Dahomey was like, hey, look, we're going to oppose your shit, right? It slowed down what the Europeans were up to. But of course it was like, well, okay, the Europeans can find a workaround, because it's not like, you know, Dahomey was the entirety of Africa. They find a workaround because you don't have alliance with other neighboring groups. And when they find that workaround, you start to suffer, you know? And that's something that we have to factor in. Like what Matron and Mr. IC3 Black was saying, you know, you have to have that international mindset as well. That's why I go by a multinationalist, right? I say multinationalism in a sense of you want to have multiple nations, right? But mainly you do want to have a nation, at least, or at minimum. So let me see what the comments are. Brother Bakari says, hey, Matron, how are you? I really miss your readings. I love your voice. Okay. Mr. IC3 Black says, an international black African entity can coordinate to deliver surgical sanctions, strikes on the enemies of black Africa. Yeah. Do you have Maurice Mohammed contact information in Q-Butter? Matron says, Brother Bakari, I'm okay, and thank you. Consider Chick says, Woman King was a dysfunctional movie because it put women in charge of men, which is ludicrous. And she says, yes, I do. I have the information. I'll text it to you. And then Brother Bakari says, thank you, Consider. All right. So, that was it. Let me see. And being anxious to acquire, so on and so forth. So, after 1730, Dahomeyan slaving was placed under royal control and was much more restricted than previously. Dahomeyan slaving was placed under royal control and was much more restricted than previously. Look at that. So after you fight them, if you can't kill them, right? If you don't kill them, if you don't stop them, like shit just, you know, it is what it is. So yet the failure of this determined effort demonstrated that a single African state at the time could not emancipate itself from European control. The small size of African states and the numerous political divisions made it so much easier for Europeans to make the decisions as to Africa's role in world production and trade. So again, that's what I wanted to, that's what I was stressing about too. This is why, this is the argument for Pan-Africanism, which is why, again, I'm okay if people outside of Africa are not into Pan-Africanism. You know, obviously I'm outside of Africa and I'm into Pan-Africanism, so, you know, it is what it is. But I'm okay if somebody outside of Africa is not okay with Pan-Africanism, because realistically, what you want to do is create larger states in Africa and have less political divisions. When I say choose a country, like basically choose one of the divisions, I'm saying you can't have zero. If you can have more than one, choose more than one. So what happens right now, for instance, in Tanzania is that they are slowly, but not surely, but slowly trying to become the East African Federation. Okay? And so then they will be this big economic bloc of East Africa, and therefore have better negotiation across the world and across Africa. Right? That's something you ought to work on. But yeah, he's saying, look, if you have the small little entities, you're going to lose to the Europeans, because the Europeans are not coming as small little entities. You know? Consider says we have to be in charge of our areas. Yep. Sorry. Many guilty consciences have been created by the slave trade. Europeans know that they carried on the slave trade, and Africans are aware that the trade would have been impossible if certain Africans did not cooperate with the slave ships. You know, I'll tell you guys this. Martin Delaney said it, that every single ship that operated in African waters was handled by Africans. So yeah, that's a thing. So anyway, well, obviously I don't want to say everyone, but it was pretty much like that. It was, but bear in mind that when we say Africans, we don't mean continental Africans, strictly. Africans, because we're also Africans, or let's say we in the diaspora are also Africans. These would have been our ancestors too, who were cooperating with the Europeans. And then, of course, you know, it came back to bite us. So to case their guilty conscience, Europeans try to throw the major responsibility for the slave trade onto the Africans. One European author of a book on the slave trade, appropriately entitled Sins of Our Father, explained how many other white people urged him to state that the trade was the responsibility of African chiefs, and that Europeans merely turned up to buy the captives, as though without European demand there would have been captives sitting on the beach by the millions. Issues such as those are not the principal concern of the study, but they can be correctly approached only after understanding that Europe became the center of a worldwide system, and that it was European capitalism which set slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in motion. And also, by the way, you wouldn't really call this capitalism, but it is what it is. But like when you look at it as capitalism, then obviously that's why some people articulate a dislike for capitalism. But usually you wouldn't call the slave system capitalism. So the trade in human beings from Africa was a response to external factors. The trade in human beings from Africa was a response to external factors. At first, the labor was needed in Portugal, Spain, and Atlantic islands such as Sao Tome, Cape Verde, and the Canaries. Then came the period when the Greater Antilles and the Spanish-American mainland needed replacements for the Indians who were victims of genocide, and the demand of Caribbean and mainland plantation societies had to be met. The records show direct connection between levels of export from Africa and European demand for slave labor in some parts of the American plantation economy. When the Dutch took Pernambuco in Brazil in 1734, the director of the Dutch West Indian Company immediately informed their agents on the Gold Coast that they were to take the necessary steps to pursue the trade in slaves on the adjacent coast area east of the Volta, thus creating for the area the infamous name of the Slave Coast. When the British West Indian Islands took to growing sugarcane, the Gambia was one of the first places to respond. Examples of this kind of external control can be instanced right up to the end of the trade, and this embraces Eastern Africa also, since European markets in the Indian Ocean islands became important in the 18th and 19th century, and since demands in places like Brazil caused Mozambicans to be shipped around the Cape of Good Hope. So, 3.2. Africa's contribution to the economy and beliefs of early capitalist Europe. So I'm going to read Consider Cheeks' comment. She says, Africa just needs to come together as one. Yeah. You know. All right, so I'll try to speed up though, because this is actually longer than I thought. So 3.2, Africa's contribution to the economy. Okay, so this kind of benefits, the kinds of benefits which Europe derives from its control of world commerce are fairly well known. Although it is curious that the recognition of Africa's major contribution to European development is usually made in works devoted specifically to that subject, while European scholars of Europe often treat the European economy as if it were entirely independent. European economists of the 19th century certainly had no illusions about the interconnection between their national economies and the world at large. J.S. Mill, as spokesman for British capitalism, said that as far as England was concerned, the trade of the West Indies is hardly to be considered as external trade, but more resembles the traffic between town and country. By the phased trade of the West Indies, Mill meant the commerce between Africa, England, and the West Indies, because without African labor, the West Indies were valueless. Karl Marx also commented on the way that European capitalists tied Africa, the West Indies, and Latin America into the capitalist system, and being the most bitter critic of capitalism, Marx went on to point out that what was good for Europeans was obtained at the expense of untold suffering by Africans and American Indians. Marx noted that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the turning of Africa into a commercial warren for the hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. So, I guess that's why people are saying, relating capitalism to the slavery, because Marx apparently has done that. So some attempts have been made to try and quantify the actual monetary profit. So the reason why I stress that, by the way, that Marx said it, is because essentially most people, when it comes to what is considered scientific socialism is what people call Marxism. Okay? So a lot of times when you talk about capitalism as an economic system, you have to note that you're actually talking about what Marx was saying. You know what I mean? Because essentially the Europeans did not call it capitalism themselves. You get what I'm saying? So the person who one of the quote unquote social scientists, if you will, who made up those ideological terms that Mr. IC3 Black was just listening to us, one of them was Marx. Okay, and that's why it's a little bit it's not important per se, but it's a little bit more relevant. To see what he was defining, because these are terms that he pretty much created, in a sense, or defined for the rest of us, or for the Europeans really, and then we just kind of run along with it, 100 years later. So some attempts have been made to try and quantify the actual monetary profits made by Europeans from engaging in the slave trade. The actual dimensions are not easy to fix, but the profits were fabulous. John Hawkins made 3 trips to West Africa in the 1560s and stole Africans whom he sold to the Spanish in America. On returning to England after the first trip, his profit was so handsome that Queen Elizabeth I became interested in directly participating in his next venture, and she provided for that purpose a ship named the Jesus. Hawkins left with the Jesus to steal some more Africans, and he returned to England with such dividends that Queen Elizabeth made him a knight. Hawkins chose as his coat of arms a representation of an African in chains. Can you imagine that? Jesus, and yeah. But again, the European is supposed to look out for the European. It's we who didn't look out for us. That's what it is. So, hold on a second. Am I still connected? Let me just double check. One thing is that I'm on my Wi-Fi, so that's another thing. All right, so it looks like I might be still connected. I think I have some more comments. So Conchita says, Africa just needs to come together as one. I think I read that. Mr. IC3 Black says, on what basis should Africa come together as one? Africa come together as one. How? Money, skin color, tribe, religion. What are you thinking? So that's a possible conversation. Of course, there were inevitably voyages that failed, slave ships that were lost at sea, etc. Sometimes trade in Africa did well, while at other times it was the profit in the Americas that was really substantial. When all the ups and downs were ironed out, the level of profit had to be enough to justify continued participation in that particular form of trade for centuries. A few bourgeois scholars have tried to suggest that the trade in slaves did not have worthwhile monetary returns. They would have us believe that the same entrepreneurs whom they praised in other contexts as the heroes of capitalist development were so dumb with regard to slavery and slave trade that for centuries they absorbed themselves in a non-profit venture. This kind of argument is worth nothing more as an example of the distortion of which white bourgeois scholarship is capable than as something requiring serious consideration. Besides, quite apart from capital accumulation, Europe's trade with Africa gave numerous stimuli to Europe's growth. Central and South American gold and silver mined by Africans played a crucial role in meeting the needs for coin in the expanding capitalist money economy of Western Europe, while African gold was also significant in that respect. African gold helped the Portuguese to finance further navigations around the Cape of Good Hope and into Asia ever since the 15th century. African gold was also the main source for the mintage of Dutch gold coin in the 17th century, helping Amsterdam to become the financial capital of Europe in that period. And further, it was no coincidence that when the English struck a new gold coin in 1663, they call it the guinea. The Encyclopedia Britannica explains that the guinea was a gold coin at one time current in the United Kingdom. It was first coined in 1663. In the reign of Charles II, from gold imported from the Guinea coast of West Africa by a company of merchants trading under a charter from the British Crown, hence the name. So, yeah, and actually I did pick up on that I didn't pick up on that, but, yeah, one of the coins inside of England is called, like you know how you have the pound and you have the sterling, you also have the guinea. So, yeah. All right, so throughout the 17th and 18th century, and for most of the, and guinea is like a word in Africa, obviously. Throughout the 17th and 18th century and for most of the 19th century, the exploitation of African and African labor continued to be a source for accumulation of capital to be reinvested in Western Europe. The African contribution to European capitalist growth extended over such vital sectors as shipping, insurance, the formation companies, capitalist agriculture, technology, and the manufacture of machinery. The effects were so wide-ranging that many are seldom brought to the notice of the reading public. For instance, the French St. Malo fishing industry was revived by the opening up of markets in the French slave plantations, while the Portuguese in Europe depended heavily on dyes like indigo, camwood, Brazil wood, and coichanol brought from Africa and the Americas. Gum from Africa also played a part in the textile industry, which is acknowledged as having been one of the most powerful engines growth within the European economy. Then there was the export of ivory from Africa, enriching many merchants in London's Mincing Lane and providing the raw material for industry in England, France, Germany, Switzerland, and North America, producing items ranging from knife handles to piano keys, right? I'm actually kind of missing this. The exploitation of African labor continued to the accumulation of capital. African contribution to, oh yeah. So, yeah, so this whole thing is, you know, again, the European went to Africa for their own benefit. They had their own agenda. You know, you don't want to take credit. You don't want to take credit. You know, for people using you, you don't want to take credit. Pretty much. Like, for instance, if I were to find it, like if I were to go to a church, hear somebody who was singing well, and then tell them, hey, if you can sing on my track, you know, sing for me, right? Sing this for me, and then, you know, whatever. I'll pay you for it, right? I pay them, and then I sell their music, and I make a bunch of money for myself, right? I had an agenda. And they're bragging to me, you know, I made you all that money? Yeah. Well, you should have done it yourself. You should, and it's like, well, I couldn't do it myself. Well, then there you go. Like, there you go. And obviously, you know, obviously you don't like that. You know, we don't want to hear that. We want to think, hey, we could get our fair share. But you got to realize, so if I do that to my own people, that's one thing. But if I do that to another people, like if I find a white girl, like for instance, I'll do it that way, for instance. All right, you guys heard of two girls, one cup. I never watched it because, you know, it was creepy. I mean, I heard about it. But basically, it's this idea that these two girls, I think they're pretending to play with feces or eat feces or something like that. Whatever, right? It was one of the earlier viral videos, you know, in the internet, right? But like, let's say that I go find two white girls and say, hey, look, I want you to pretend to eat feces for a video, right? I'll pay you, you know, some money, right? I have an agenda to make money off of their labor, right? And if they come to me later after I made this money and say, that's not fair, you should give me more money, they should have known that they're not my people. And that's what it comes, like, the thing. There's a Chancellor Williams interview. There's a couple of Chancellor Williams interviews, right? And I copied some of them into my book. I wrote the Book of Power, right? But I copied some of the excerpts from that interview. He says one of the things the Arab did was he approached Africans and said, "Hey, look, I got a religion of brotherhood. Okay? I have a religion of brotherhood." That's where you effed up, because you were looking at another species and trying to find brotherhood with them, knowing full damn well you're not supposed to do that. Now, granted, you might say, well, African people, we do make, fellowship with animals. You know what I mean? Like, we could walk around with a lion and shit. Okay, that's fine and well and good. But if you understand who the European is, he does not make friends with lions. He only makes friends with dogs. And he fucks them up. And he fucked them over. Okay? If you looked at what the wolves used to be versus, a dog dressed up in a tutu, the white man effed them up. So when he comes to you about brotherhood, no. And that's your fault. I'm looking at the comments, sorry. So Brother Bakari answered Mr. IC3 Black. He says, on basis of race, the 48 of countries run by black people. Mr. IC Black says, okay, interesting. How do you define race exactly? Clear identification is necessary for effective organization. Brother Bakari says, I have to explain race. There's no need for this conversation. I'll ask you a crazy question. How do you decide who gets reparations? Right? So I guess they're going to go back. They're going to go about thing. So we'll keep ourselves updated as that conversation progresses. And you can see it on the screen. So after being drawn into the orbit of Western Europe, after being drawn into the orbit of Western Africa, speed up the latter's technological development. No, Africa being drawn into the orbit of... So I kept reading after. Africa being drawn into the orbit of Western Europe sped up the latter's technological development. For example, the evolution of European shipbuilding from the 16th century to the 19th century was a logical consequence of their monopoly of sea commerce in that period. I'll say again, you wouldn't take credit over that. Oh yeah, well the reason why they had better ships is because they kept stealing us. Like what? Like, I mean, sure, but again, like, you know what I mean? It's like the cows saying, the reason why the white man has such good machinery for doing milk. For milking animals is because we are here. Like, yeah, he's using you. He's using you. You're not, nobody's saying that the cow's contribution to the agricultural, nobody thinks the cow is contributing anything to the agricultural landscape. Like a cow that's proud of how much European agriculture advanced because of their exploitation is not a sound cow. Just gonna throw it out there. So, for example, the evolution of was a logical consequence of the monopoly of sea commerce in that period. During that time, the North Africans were bottled up in the Mediterranean, and although it was from them that Europeans initially borrowed a great deal of nautical instrumentation. What do you mean borrow? They stole that shit. North Africans made no further worthwhile advances. Yeah, they destroyed their kingdom. They took over their ports. Yeah, so where the original European advantage was not sufficient to assure supremacy, they deliberately undermined other people's efforts. And that's what they're supposed to do. I want people I'm going to talk about that in my next book. You're supposed to undermine other people. So the Indian Navy, for instance, suffered from the rigid enforcement of the English naval navigation laws. Yet the expenses involved in building new and better European ships were met from the profits of overseas trades with India, Africa, etc. The Dutch were pioneers in improving upon the which took the Spanish and Portuguese out across the Atlantic, and a succession of Dutch trading companies operating in Asia, Africa, and Americas were the ones responsible for experimentation. By the 18th century, the British were using Dutch know-how as a basis for surpassing the Dutch themselves, and the Atlantic was their laboratory. It used to be said that the slave trade was a training ground for British seamen. It is probably more significant to note that the Atlantic trade was a stimulator of consistent advances in naval technology. The most spectacular feature in Europe, which was connected with African trade, was the rise of seaport towns, notably Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, Bordeaux, and Seville. I actually read that right correctly, I think. Or Bordeaux. Right. But directly or indirectly connected to those ports there often emerged the manufacturing centers which gave rise to the Industrial Revolution. In England, it was the county of Lancashire, which was the first center of the Industrial Revolution, and the economic advance in Lancashire depended first on the growth of the port of Liverpool through slave trading. So what I would normally think before reading this, what Marx was just saying just now, was how this was the advent of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution. I mean, Lancashire. But of course, the argument here is because essentially the way how the Europeans talk about economics, and it's actually the next sentence, slavery and capitalism, but is that there was a slavery system that became capitalism, or like a feudalist system that became slavery or something like that. But anyway, so the connection between slavery and capitalism and the growth of England is adequately documented by Eric Williams in his well-known book, Capitalism and Slavery. Williams gives a clear picture of the numerous benefits which England derived from trading and exploiting slaves, and he identified by name several of the personalities in capitalist firms who were the beneficiaries. Outstanding examples are provided in the persons of David and Alexander Barclay, who were engaging in slave trade in 1756, and who later used the loot to set up Barclays Bank. There was a similar progression in the case of, and of course there's the Barclays Center in America, in Brooklyn, where Jay-Z is reportedly a shareholder. Right, so there was a similar progression in the case of Lloyd's, from being a small London coffee house to being one of the world's largest banking and insurance houses after dipping into profits from slave trade and slavery. Then there was James Watts, expressing eternal gratitude to the West Indian slave owners who directly financed his famous steam engine and took it from the drawing board to the factory. Right. Yeah. So again, this is like irrelevant. You use this is irrelevant, but whatever. A similar picture would emerge from any detailed study of French capitalism and slavery, given that fact that during the 18th century, the West Indies accounted for 20% of France's external trade, much more than the whole of Africa in the present century. Of course, benefits were not always directly proportionate to the amount of involvement of the given European states in the Atlantic trade. The enormous profits of Portuguese overseas enterprises passed rapidly out of Portuguese economy into the hands of the more developed Western European capitalist nations who supplied Portugal with capital, ships, and trade goods. Germany was included in this category along with England, Holland, and France. Commerce deriving from Africa helped a great deal to strengthen transnational links within the Western European economy. So, sorry, I was just thinking about what I'm going to do tomorrow. Let me see what the comments are. This is pretty involved. In Africa, they can come together on race, fighting colonization, come together based on sharing resources, or come together because in every country, black people is being oppressed. Brother, Mr. RCT Black says, okay, so you refuse to answer my question. I assume that is because you are unable to answer my question. I'll answer your question. Why? Because I can. And then Brother Bakari says, I think the question is dumb. Living in race-based society and you can't determine race explains a lot about our condition. Europeans studied and worked more on shipbuilding because they had to leave Europe. Some left to avoid persecution because of religion. Most left because nothing was there, right? And then Mr. RCD Black says, question you asked, how do you decide who gets reparations? Answer, I do not decide who gets reparations. Our black African organization have a system procedure. I'll explain. And then Brother Bakari says, nothing being there explains why they are today. They never had nothing, so sharing was not in their vocabulary. Anything they ran across, they hoard because of fear of not having. Yeah. I mean, what Brother Bakari said, the last thing right there, I think. So Carlos Cooks is a really popular, was the between Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, was like in chronologically, was Carlos Cooks, and Carlos Cooks said you got to pay attention to this. The European does not share any continent. Okay, so he doesn't share Australia, he doesn't share North America, he doesn't share Europe. Okay, he does like he doesn't share Europe. Of course, you might be willing to share, but he doesn't, and that's a really, in fact, if you're really being honest, the Asians don't either. But it is what it is. But yeah, okay. So you guys could do your thing. So commerce deriving from Africa helped a great deal. Although I will say this, I will say that we should not be, let's say, arguing with each other. You know what I mean? Or because I noticed this. I think it was it was Brother Bakari's thing where this dude and his sister just started, going back and forth and debating and arguing. And it's like when we talk about unity, right? Now it's okay to. It's obviously okay to. It's obviously okay to dialogue, but when we talk about unity, we also have to show it. And this is why, actually, I'll go back to what Nkrumah said. Nkrumah said, unity presupposes organization. Okay? So to say that one of the issues that black people have is that we are not really a part of organizations together. And when you're not a part of organizations together, it's harder to be united. And that's what happened to our ancestors. Those ethnic groups are technically organizations together, but they're not organizations. But that's what it is. They were micro-organizations. And the nation is just another organization. So if you're a part of a nation, you're part of an organization. But the races, unfortunately, are not organizations in the same sense as to say they don't have a hierarchy, they don't have a leadership, they don't have anything, right? And because of that, that's one of the problems. So one of the things that Marcus Garvey was pushing was not so much he was doing like an all black organization, or like everybody in the world was a part of his organization, all the black people in the world were part of his organization. But like one of the goals was to build up an African nation, like a super state. Because that's another thing to remember too, is that, there's no all Asian organization. There's no all European organization per se, or at least like recently you have the European Union, but even so, like in terms of its authority, it's just not there. But anyway, let's keep going. Commerce deriving from Africa helped a great deal to strengthen transnational links within the Western European economy, bearing in mind that American produce was the consequence of African labor. Brazilian dyewoods, for example, were re-exported from Portugal into the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and the Baltic, and passed into the continental cloth industry of the 17th century. Sugar from the Caribbean was re-exported from England and France to other parts of Europe to such an extent that Hamburg in Germany was the biggest sugar refining center in Europe in the first half of the 18th century. Germany supplied manufacturers to Scandinavia, Holland, England, France, and Portugal for resale in Africa. England, France, and Holland found it necessary to exchange various classes of goods, the better to deal with the Africans for gold, slaves, and ivory. The financiers and merchants of Genoa were the powers behind the markets of Lisbon and Seville, while Dutch bankers played a similar role with respect to Scandinavia and England. Western Europe was the part of Europe in which, by the 15th century, the trend was most visible that feudalism was giving way to capitalism. And then he has an asterisk. In Eastern Europe, feudalism was still strong in the 19th century. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about Russia. Russia going from feudalism to socialism. So the peasants were being driven off the land in England, and agriculture was becoming a capitalist operation. It was also becoming technologically more advanced, producing food and fibers to support a larger population and to provide a more effective basis for the woolen and linen industries in particular. The technological base of industry, as well as its social and economic organization, was being transformed. African trade speeded up several aspects, including the integration of Western Europe, as noted above. That is why the African connection contributed not merely to economic growth, which relates to quantitative dimensions, but also to real development in the sense of increased capacity for further growth and independence. In speaking of the European slave trade, mention must be made of the USA, not only because its dominant population was European, but also because Europe transferred its capital institutions more completely to North America than to any other part of the globe, and established a powerful form of capitalism. After eliminating the indigenous inhabitants and exploiting the labor of millions of Africans, like other parts of the New World, the American colonies of the British Crown were used as means of accumulating primary capital for re-export to Europe. But the northern colonies also had direct access to benefits from slavery in the American South and in the British and French West Indies. As in Europe, the profits were made from slavery and slave trade went firstly to commercial ports and industrial areas, which meant mainly the northeastern seaboard district known as New England and the state of New York. The Pan-Africanist W.B. Du Bois, in a study of the American slave trade, quoted as report of 1862 as follows: "The number of persons engaged in the slave trade and the amount of capital embarked in it exceeds our power of calculation. The city of New York has been, until of late, 1862, the principal port of the world for this infamous commerce, although the cities of Portland and Boston meet only second to her in that distribution." So, you have New York City. I don't know if Portland and Boston have I feel like they have big. I know a sister from Portland and from Boston, but I don't know if it has a big black population. So I won't say anything. But yeah, I'm in New York City. But anyway, so let's go. American economic. Oh, sorry, I see it in the comments. I see that I'm at it, so I'm gonna see what's going on. So Mr. IC3 Black says, Brother Bakari, to decide who gets reparations, one must follow a successful plan. This is the plan, right? Yeah, and that's true. In the sense of you want an organization that, like, you need an organization. Brother Bakari says, race is based on skin and features. To answer your question, to say the question is dumb is disrespectful. I apologize for the disrespect. So Brother Bakari, I don't know if it was. I mean, it's a different question. Mr. ICT Black says, no, sorry, unity comes about by testing solutions. The quality of any plan is the ability of any plan to answer questions clearly, right? The reparations plan is as follows. So he's going to tell us the reparations plan. So, yeah, I mean, look, I think, yeah, I mean, so again, I would go by what Kwame Ture and Kwame Nkrumah were saying about, essentially, you need organization, you know? Because the thing is this, you could, like, because I'm an author, right? And I know I could write a book, or I could offer solutions, but if I don't have an organization, or even like that, it's like, I think it's an African proverb that goes like, if you're a leader, but you have no followers, then you're just taking a walk. You get what I'm saying? So like, if I say, hey, you know what the right thing, you know what we should do with pedophiles? We should burn them. Let's say I say we should burn them. That might be right, and I could obviously justify that in an argument, right? But like, this is not my country, right? So even if I say, hey, look, that guy R. Kelly or that guy Brother Polite, right? It's not my country. So it's the American country, and therefore they can do, like, it's really up to who has the organization, who is the nation, you know? Because in Africa, yeah, if you were messing with somebody's kid, that would be a thing, you know? Like that would be addressed. But in America, it's not, you know? So one of the things that happens is there's a sister named Aaliyah, a big American singer, right? She had a shotgun wedding. Not a shotgun wedding. She married R. Kelly, right? Because R. Kelly had impregnated her. So she married R. Kelly when she was 15 because R. Kelly had already impregnated her. Which means R. Kelly was sexually active with a 14 to 15-year-old at minimum. Okay? And so, you know, but what's the response to that? Now, you could say, hey, look, that's a pedophile, so we're going to go do something about that, right? And then you'll just end up in prison because it's not your country. Whereas in another country, in Africa or something, right, or the Middle East or somewhere, right, if somebody well-known slept with a child, right, people will come around and handle them. So you know, that's what I mean when I say that you need an organization, because even if you are right, you know, like being right and being powerful are two different things, you know, and that's where it comes back to, you know, what really handles things is war, you know, and one of the mottos that Europeans have about war is this. They say, war doesn't determine who is right. War determines who is left. Okay? I'll say that again. War does not determine who is right. War determines who is left. And at the end of the day, that's really the big question. Who is left? I go after, like somebody goes after R. Kelly shoots them, R. Kelly's left. Somebody goes after R. Kelly, they get rid of R. Kelly, and then the state gets rid of them. None of them are left. Nobody goes after R. Kelly. R. Kelly's left. You understand? Like, that's the way the world really functions. Who is left? You know? What was the invasion of America by the Europeans right? No. But who's left? So Brother Bakari, so Mr. ITG Black says, select and to effectively organize black African people. The identity that black Africa and the black African diaspora need to unite under will be a temporary identity that works like, and he's going to tell us more. Brother Bakari says, reparations is an international fight until we understand that movement goes nowhere. Okay, so we're talking about reparations. All right, so we'll be finished soon, hopefully. American economic development up to the mid-19th century rested squarely on foreign commerce, of which slavery was a pivot. In the 1830s, slave-grown cotton accounted for about half the value of all exports from the United States of America. Now, again, who sets the value? Who determines the value of this export? Cotton. Who determines the value of cotton? Furthermore, in the case of the American colonies in the 18th century, it can again be observed that Africa contributed in a variety of ways. One thing leading to another. For instance, in New England, trade with Africa, Europe, and the West Indies in slave and slave-grown products supplied cargo for the merchant marine, stimulated the growth of their shipbuilding industry, built up their towns and their cities, and enabled them to utilize their forests, fisheries, and soil more effectively. Finally, it was the carrying trade between the West Indian slave colonies and Europe which lay behind the emancipation of the American colonies from the British rule, and it was no accident that the struggle for American independence started in the leading New England town of Boston. In the 19th century, the connection with Africa continued to play an indirect role in American political growth. In the first place, profits from the slave activities went to the coffers of political parties, and even more important, the African stimulation and black labor played a vital role in extending European control over the present territory of the USA, notably in the South, but including also the so-called Wild West, where black cowboys were active. So now it's just black people are just as amazing people who, through their enslavement improves European society. Which again, it has a little bit of basis, but it's like, like I said, cows. If cows were to write things, or chickens were to write stories and say, we created it's because of us, because of our labor that KFC is an international chain. It's like, okay, you're kind of missing the point. They were eating you. You know what I'm saying? Like that's what happened with regard to slavery. They were eating us, and we're we accumulated capital for them. Okay. Slavery is useful for early accumulation of capital, but is too rigid for industrial development. Slaves had to be given crude, non-breakable tools, which held back the capitalist development of agriculture and industry. That explains the fact that the northern portion of the USA gained far more industrial benefits from slavery than the South, which actually had slave institutions on its soil. And ultimately, the stage was reached during the American Civil War when the northern capitalists fought to end slavery within the boundaries of the USA so that the country as a whole could advance to a higher level of capitalism. In effect, one can say that within the USA, the slave relations to the South had by the second century of the 19th century come into conflict with the further expansion of the productive base inside the USA as a whole, and a violent clash ensued before the capitalist relations of legally free labor became generalized. Europe maintained slavery in places that were physically remote from European society, and therefore inside Europe itself. Capitalist relations were elaborated without being adversely affected by slavery in the Americas. However, even in Europe, there came a moment when the leading capitalist states found that the trade in slaves and the use of slave labor in the Americas was no longer in the interest of their further development. Britain made this decision early in the 19th century to be followed later by France. So this was another way to look at the Civil War, as in it might have been, some people look at it as an economic war, as in the industrial capitalists against slavery in order to promote capitalism as an agenda. So since capitalism, like any other mode of production, is a total system which involves an ideological aspect, it is also necessary to focus on the effects of the trade with Africa on the development of ideas within the superstructure of European capitalist society. In that sphere, the most striking feature is undoubtedly the rise of racism as a widespread and deeply rooted element in European thought. The role of slavery in promoting racist prejudice and ideology has been carefully studied in certain situations, especially in the USA. The simple fact is that no people can enslave another for centuries without coming out with a notion of superiority, and when the color and other physical traits of the people were quite different, it was inevitable that the prejudice should take a racist form. Within Africa itself, the same can be said for the situation in the Cape Province of South Africa, where white men were establishing military and social superiority over non-whites ever since 1650. It would be much too sweeping a statement to say that all racial and color prejudice in Europe derived from the enslavement of Africans and the exploitation of non-white people in the early centuries of international trade. There were also anti-Semitism at an early date inside, and like, why does he go here? Who knows? At an even earlier date inside Europe, and there's always a element of suspicion and incomprehension when people of different cultures come together. However, it can be affirmed without reservation that the white racism which came to pervade the world was an integral part of the capitalist mode of production. Nor was it merely a question of how the individual white person treated a black person. The racism of Europe was a set of generalizations and assumptions which had no scientific basis but were rationalized in every sphere from theology to biology. Occasionally, it is mistakenly held that Europeans enslaved Africans for racist reasons. European planters and miners enslaved Africans for economic reasons, so that their labor power could be exploited. Indeed, it would have been possible to open up the New World and to use it as a constant generator of wealth had it not been for African labor. There was no other alternatives. The American Indian population was virtually wiped out, and the Europe's population was too small for settlement overseas at that time. Then, having become utterly dependent on African labor, Europeans at home and abroad found it necessary to rationalize that exploitation in racist terms as well. Oppression follows logically from exploitation, so as to guarantee the latter. Oppression of African people on purely racist grounds accompanied, strengthened, and became indistinguishable from oppression for economic reasons. So, T.L. James, noted Pan-Africanist and Marxist, once remarked that the race question is subsidiary to the class question in politics, and to think of imperialism in terms of race is disastrous. But to neglect the racial factor as merely incidental is an error only less grave than to make it fundamental. So, as I say, he's saying, hey, look, it's race and class, which is not unreasonable. I don't think it's unreasonable. So it can further be argued. Well, I mean, I don't know if I would say class actually, but yeah, I don't know if I would say class, but what I'm saying is that this is not unreasonable. It can further be argued that by the 19th century, white racism had become so institutionalized in the capitalist world, and notably in the USA, that it sometimes ranked above the maximization of profits as the motive for oppressing black people. Right? So he's like, racism is even bigger than profits. In the short run, European racism seemed to have done Europeans no harm, and they had used those erroneous ideas to justify their further domination of non-European people in the colonial epoch. But the international proliferation of bigoted and unscientific racist ideas was bound to have its negative consequences in the long run. When Europeans put millions of their brothers, Jews, into ovens under the Nazis, the chickens were coming home to roost. Such behavior inside of a democratic Europe was not as strange as it sometimes made out to be. There were always a contradiction between the elaboration of democratic ideas inside Europe and the elaboration of authoritarian and thuggish practices by Europeans with respect to Africans. When the French Revolution was made in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity, it did not extend to black Africans who were enslaved by France in the West Indies and the Indian Ocean. Indeed, France fought against the efforts of those people to emancipate themselves, and the leaders of their bourgeois revolution said plainly that they did not make it on behalf of black humanity. Right? So let me go look back at the comments. It goes nowhere. So Mr. ICT Black says a work uniform that works like a work uniform. Black Africa must put a temporary identity like a worker puts on a uniform to do a specific job. When the job is done, we take off the uniform identity. Step 2, Black Africa and the Black African diaspora organized under the new temporary identity will allow us to have leverage power. Step 3, reparations is not the correct word. We will use that word temporarily. Step 4, the unified new entity will form a sovereign entity. That sovereign black entity will extract what it needs from the complete financial, political, and cultural ecosystem of white supremacy. So he looks like he's giving out steps towards reparations, but I think he said reparations is not the right word, which is interesting. All right, so it is not even true to say that capitalism developed democracy at home in Europe and not abroad. At home, it was responsible for a talk or certain rhetoric of freedom, but it was never extended from the bourgeois to the oppressed workers. And the treatment of Africans must surely have made such a hypocrisy a habit of European life, especially within the ruling class. How else can one explain the fact that the Christian church participated fully in the maintenance of slavery and still talking about saving souls? The hypocrisy reached its highest levels inside the USA. The first martyr in the American National War of Liberation against the British colonialists in the 18th century was an African descent, Crispus Attucks, and both slave and free Africans played a key role in Washington's army, and yet the American Constitution, with its famous preamble that all men are created equal, sanctioned the continued enslavement of Africans in recent times. It has become an object of concern to some liberals that the USA is capable of war crimes of the order of My Lai in Vietnam, but the fact of the matter is that My Lais began with the enslavement of Africans and American Indians. Racism, violence, and brutality were the concomitants of the capitalist system when it extended itself abroad in the early centuries of international trade. So this is now after every chapter, I guess he gives us a reading. This brief guide to reading. The subject of Africa's contribution to European development reveals several of the factors which limits a writer's representation of reality. Language and nationality, for instance, are effective barriers to communication. Works in English seldom take account of the effect brought about in France, Holland, or Portugal by participation in slaving and other forms of commerce which exploited Africa in the pre-colonial period. That's something that we didn't really mention, but Europe had, by the time of the 1490s or whatever, it had its own European language, like a trade language, a language that belonged to nobody, and that was Latin. So a lot of people could study Latin and rewrite in Latin, whereas a lot of the tribes in Africa, if you will, or a lot of the ethnic groups in Africa, did not have one unifying language. Like every group had their own language, and that really hurts division, especially if you don't have a overarching system that can link the languages together. Like as it stands right now, most of us in the chat speak English. And that's probably why you can hear me, listen to me, and understand me. But let's say if I was speaking Swahili, it would be a different chat. You know what I mean? It would be a different chat. And if I was speaking Twi, it would be a different chat. And even my talks about unity and liberty and whatever, or just my ideas, whatever it is, right? We don't recognize how important language is, which is why I still advocate for Swahili, because I think it was actually Museveni, he said too, Swahili is nobody's language, so nobody gets an advantage from everybody speaking Swahili, as opposed to if everybody was speaking Twi, obviously, the Akan would get the advantage. Or if everybody was speaking Yoruba, obviously the Yoruba would get an advantage. But when it comes to Swahili, nobody speaks that language. The ideological gulf, and it's already widespread. Like it's already well past the borders of the creators of the language. The ideological gulf is responsible for the fact that most bourgeois scholars write about phenomena such as the Industrial Revolution in England without once mentioning the European slave trade as a factor in primary accumulation of capital. The reason because nobody really cares. Nobody cares how you got your money first. And I think black people need to just get over, oh yeah, well, we're the primary accumulation of capital. Yeah, okay, sure. But nobody cares. It's like I got this restaurant, right? I bought a restaurant in Tanzania. Where did I get the money for a restaurant? Who cares? Is that important? Is that something to stop me and say, oh, well, you really got that money from... who cares? Or you might say, hey, well, Oni, you did this. Where did I get the money from? If let's say somebody were to hit up my Cash App, right? I'm not, where'd you get the money from? I don't give a shit. You know what I'm saying? As long as you got money, you got money. And that's the thing that black people like when we talk about Europeans participating in the slave trade. Yeah, it was a profitable business. You could steal people and then sell them to people who wanted stolen people. Now, I personally wouldn't do that, obviously, but I say that because I'm in 2023 where nobody has business stealing people. But one, people do that. People do want human labor. In fact, I could even say that to this day, the Arabs are stealing, are using, Africans as slaves. In fact, when Malcolm X went to Mecca, I believe, right? Or Malcolm X went to Saudi Arabia or wherever he went, some Arab country, he had a guide who purposely led him to places where he wouldn't see African people being enslaved. And there's videos from 1968, the same year he goes to wherever, where you could see the markets, where you see the little girls being sold, and some of the girls look like hybrids. They look like they're mixed, like Arab and African. I'm just saying, like we have to pay attention to, we have to pay attention to, like, nobody cares if you're the primary, like, nobody cares as long as you have the money, you could do whatever. Like I said, this restaurant, you know, if you accumulate the capital, you accumulate enough profit, you could then buy another restaurant and another restaurant, and then eventually you could buy, you know, you could buy a freaking, you know, whatever, you could buy a farm, you could buy this, you know, whatever you do, however you get your money, you get it, and then you use it to make yourself richer. The whole idea of, well, you know, you wouldn't have had, like, nobody cares. And that's me saying this, you know, like I'm just saying that, you know, us being hung up on, oh, well, you know, that's how they got it. Yeah, obviously. Anyway, obviously, Marx himself had laid great emphasis on sources of overseas capital accumulation, but Marxists, as prominent as Maurice Dobb and J.E. Hobson, for many years concentrated on examining the evolution of capitalism out of feudalism inside Europe, with only marginal reference to the massive exploitation of Africans, Asians, and American Indians. Yeah, of course, because what they're trying to do, you got to understand, and this is the thing that a lot of us don't understand. You want to do something where you can learn, like you study history to learn how to do something well for yourself. Okay? If the slave trade, like, because I remember one sister, she was actually actually she called herself a Rodneyite. Okay, so she was like, you know, into Walter Rodney and all that kind of stuff. But she was a socialist, Marxist, all that kind of stuff. And so when somebody challenged her on, you know, how could you make Africa wealthy? She said, well, we can't make Africa wealthy because in order to be wealthy, you need to get capital accumulation. Like, you need to colonize another people or enslave another people, and there's no more people to get enslaved or colonized, right? And it's like, that's why you got to understand why you're studying history. Because if you're studying history to tell you something that you don't want to do or you can't do, right? There's no point in studying that part. Like, if you're not willing to enslave people, and I hope you aren't, but if you're not willing to enslave people, then there's no point in you studying slavery. Okay? I'm not saying there's no point, but what I mean is that you want to study how, like for instance, like Cassandra was just talking about housing markets and how to lease property. I would study that because that's something that I could do. You get what I'm saying? Or I might look into Trump or whomever, you know, whoever a real estate tycoon or whatever, but not Trump, but, you know, somebody real, right? I would look into that just so, or I'll study under Cassandra just so I could understand how to do what she's talking about. But if Cassandra's teaching us, oh, well, you know, slavery is a way to make money, that means nothing to me because I'm not going to enslave nobody. And that's what we have to realize. It's like, yeah, you know, Marxists, as prominent as Maurice and so on and so forth, they only examine the evolution of, yeah, because they already have the capital, and they say, you know what can we do with the capital we accumulated? Not, oh, well, you know, shit, maybe we should, let's give Africa, let's, because the thing is, the only argument you can make if you start saying the benefits of enslaving people is to go enslave other people, which is stupid for an African person to argue. I'll just say it like that. So these are some of the books: Eric Williams, Capitalism and Capitalism and Slavery; Oliver Cox, Capitalism as a System. So Cox, an African American, makes the capitalism as a system makes the basic point that capitalism has from very early times been an international system. Eric Williams, a West Indian, was very precise and very detailed in illustrating the connection between British capitalism and the enslavement of Africans. So now you have the Du Bois, which is the suppression of African slave trade to the USA. I heard this was actually a good book. I never read it, though. Richard Paris, Yankees and Creoles, a trade between North America. Since both of these provide data on the contribution of African labor to the development of capitalism in the USA in the epic of slavery. So Leo Huberman wrote down Man's Worldly Goods, the story of the wealth of nations. Oh, that sounds interesting. And E. Claremont, Economic Liberalism and Underdevelopment. These are really good titles. I need to get my title game up. I don't think I write good titles. But anyway, so Huberman's book is an excellent overall treatment of the development of capitalism out of feudalism in Europe. Huberman's book is an excellent overall treatment of the development of capitalism out of feudalism in Europe. It includes a section in which the role of slavery is highlighted. Claremont's study accords recognition to the role played by the subcontinent of India in building Europe. The image of P. Curtin's The Image of Africa, and Winthrop Jordan, White Over Black, American Attitudes Toward the Negro. The two texts are relevant to the question of the rise of white racism, although neither of the two makes sufficiently explicit the connection between racism and capitalism. Okay, and that's it. So that was chapter 3. Looks like chapter 4 is pretty long. Let me see. Chapter 4, yeah, see, so the thing that we just read was one of 28 pages. Chapter 4 was one of 88 pages. So we might actually split that up into 3 parts, you know, just because this actually takes a long time. So I'll think about that. I'll have to up the number in the chat. But other than that, let's just read the remaining comments if there are any more, and go from there. So Mr. IC3 Black says if you guys have any final comments, let me know. Other than that, this will be the end of the podcast. Okay. So Mr. IC3 Black says the extraction from the ecosystem of white supremacy by this new international black entity is a serving of reparatory justice to itself. And Brother Macari says these people use those ships and their military to travel the world and build systems for themselves. They use free African labor to enrich themselves. We are still trying to figure out race. Yeah. Mr. IC3 Black says, our plan is to process the extraction reparations on a claim-by-claim basis and deposit those extractions into a central bank of black African origin. At step 5, when the new black Africa diaspora entity reaches a critical mass power, it will begin to acquire sovereign territory land from other sovereign states that give us land embassy. Okay. You know, if, like you said, if you can, you can, you know what I mean? But that's pretty much the end of the podcast. If anybody has any comments, thanks everybody for coming through and spending time with me. I know this series is kind of long, so I appreciate everybody for just being here even a little bit. I'll just look through the comments, see who was here. I didn't see my brother Kofi, but it's all good. He's probably hopefully I'll hear from him another week. But beyond that, I can't even scroll up to the top. But obviously, we had my brother Tyler Solomon, we had Matron, we had Bitter Medicine, we had Casidra, and we had Brother Bakari, and we had Mr. IC3 Black. I don't know if we had anybody else, but appreciation for everybody who was here. And of course, appreciation for everybody who was here. Make sure you guys check out the podcast, the other podcast on the network. And I think maybe even later today, you'll probably hear from Brother Bakari or Casidra Cheeks. But so make sure you guys check it out. Give some support. Drop some likes. Put some comments. Let's get the algorithm going. This was a nice program. I think it was pretty beneficial. And I hope I can speak with you guys again next week. But other than that, Shemim Hotep, Anku Jah Seneb Neb, Amen, Ma'at, Dua, Netre.